questions now because I would have been saying this in the body of the meeting. I think Councillor Fletcher's question is a good one, and, you know, there's no doubt in many people's minds that this has been a complex process, but a much-needed process. You know, I know the Mayor and I didn't agree at the start of the 17A reviews about what the outcome was going to be. My hope was that this was to, yes, find savings, but it was to help the organisation find better ways, more sensible ways and more comprehensive ways of doing some of the work that we do. So this isn't just about saving money, it needs to work. So I thank you for accepting the recommendations that I had offered up as changes, because my concern was that the way the recommendations were stated in the report, that they simply said we accept unchallenged and unfettered the recommendations that are in the report, and we will now send our good staff out to implement them. And there's no doubt in my mind that whilst many of these recommendations are indeed worthy, there are many recommendations in here that may not save us money and they could cost us money. There are many recommendations in here that are already underway and don't need to be replicated, and there are some recommendations in here that don't tell the whole story, and we need to work with our staff to actually get a better outcome than some of the recommendations point at here. So the work has been done well. I want to, you know, acknowledge the reviewers and the intent of the review, but the recommendations don't have the whole answer. So we're pretty hard out on savings, we're pretty hard out on getting the value for money for our ratepayers, but we also don't want to commit ourselves to some of the recommendations in here which are a fundamental change in policy, and some of them, to be absolutely blunt, Mr Chair, are undoable. And particularly in the areas that I'm connected with most intimately, being water and waste, there are some recommendations in here that I think need a jolly good look with our staff involved and our Chief Executive to work out whether they will actually deliver any value to us. So thank you for the opportunity to put that step in the process. I think it makes it a lot more transparent, a lot more useful, and hopefully will result in much better process and a better path than the one we were heading down. Thank you.
Before I just take it, just so we've got to move in a second to there, I'm just hoping we don't dig down into why we're doing this, because we don't need to do this. And I went back to the early minutes from the 21st of March when we approved it. 18 out of 23 of the councillors and the Independent Maori Statutory Board and the Mayor recommended we go ahead with this work program. There were 5 people that were away, so it was unanimous of those that was there. So I hope we don't have to dig into that. So
people against it can't be unanimous.
So just so we're quite clear, you weren't here, Councillor Casey, no. So we're doing this because we're required to do this because of the legislation, but it's something in a way we're not going to be doing every 6 years from now on. We're going to be doing it all the time, because you're just going to be like a business. We're constantly looking where we can save in order to actually reinvest that money, if need be, in more worthy causes. It's as simple as that. Councillor Walker, you have something?
Well, the first thing that I'd like, Mr Chair, is to see all the parts up there so that I can see them in their totality, because right now all I'm seeing is A. Okay. And I've seen E and F because a number of these things, frankly, are somewhat joined. So can I see them now, sir?
Yep, but have you got a paper copy of the agenda?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course.
I strongly suggest you go to page 43, and it's very, very clear.
And I'm on page 43.
And doesn't it say
and I understand page 43, but I would still like to see essentially what is being put to the vote. Okay,
what's being put to the vote is what's on page 43 when it comes to Three Waters, but we'll put it up there in a minute. We're just talking to it. So what, Councillor Cooper?
So can I speak to this then, Mr Chair?
No, not yet, because Councillor Cooper?
Just a question. First, just to say, I hope we do operate in a business-like manner, and businesses don't run out and tell everybody we're going to cut staff before we actually have the conversation ourselves. For me, I just want to know, are we going to go through each of the reviews one by one? I just want to know how this is going to go so that I don't get caught on the back foot and it's too late if I want to say something. It hasn't been outlined how it's going to operate.
We're going to go through Three Waters and it will be led by Kevin and Sally, and then our other experts will be commenting and But as to how much we dig into everything, it's up to the members around here, but
Thank you.
the work has been done by the independent group of experts plus the peer group, so just reflect on that. Okay, so Kevin, so what we will do is we'll go Three Waters first, okay, and then bang, bang, bang. So we'll put up B.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
Oh,
we
no,
won't
thank
put
you,
up B,
thank
we're
you,
gonna
Mr.
have
Chair.
this.
Yes.
Yep,
No,
sorry about that.
no, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, and to a certain extent, you've actually preempted quite a bit of this, which is very, very useful. So, so look, what I was going to do was just, before we go through each of the reviews, as Councillor Cooper said, we will do that. We'll go through review by review, and we'll run through the findings which lead to those recommendations that you have in the report. If I can just do 2 slides of a bit of a recap introduction to it all. And then Sally will just do a wee bit about the methodology applied here. But look, before we go any further, for those that haven't met the team, so Sally Garrett, I think you'll all have met probably by now, who's the program lead here. And then we have Ross Churnside and Jean-Pierre Derard. So these are the 2 CFO and economist by trade who have actually come on board to actually lead a lot of the individual reviews. So what the team has done is sort of giving a lead on each of the reviews that are undertaken, although the whole team's been involved. And so what we're going to do today is each of the relevant leads for those reviews will walk you through the presentation we have, which outlines the findings and leads to those recommendations. So, as I mentioned, look, 2 little slides just on an opening, bit of introductory piece. As already mentioned, under 17A of the Local Government Act, we are required to review the cost effectiveness of those current arrangements. Every council has been obligated to go through that process. Our Mayor extended that, and the notion there is to identify strategic opportunities to improve value for money. So it incorporates 17A within it, and the team is consciously aware that they need to make sure we're able to show compliance with legislation, but too good an opportunity not to express or to examine value for money in a more general sense. Finance Performance Committee was mandated to pick this particular piece of work up, and it endorsed the approach. That was March 2017. And then we started the work in June 17 on those first 4 services as part of this, what we anticipate to be a 3-year rolling program. Look, today, the purpose of today is to present those first 4 reviews that have now been completed to the initial stage. But look, as has already been mentioned, and I want to thank the Chair and also Councillor Hulse for elaborating it, making the intent more explicit in the new recommendations. It always was the intention, and it was the substance, the basis of this approach, but it is much more explicit now. And that is this point, that this is identifying potential value. So it doesn't include implementation costs, it doesn't include the timing, it doesn't include the cost of actually implementing some of these. So those are all what happens at the next stage. So that's now much more explicit in those recommendations. Look, the hope that you'll see is that it has been a very transparent process. To a certain extent, it does expose things. It's actually looking at the current state and putting all those findings up there, and what you'll find is the improvements are future focused. But I just want to emphasise that point, current and future, because sometimes what you'll find in these is that the organisation, the industries have reached a certain stage of maturity where the changes can now occur. This is not looking back and saying things weren't working. In fact, in some cases in those reports you'll see compliments that the various parties involved have actually been doing a very good job in achieving the intent. What it is saying though is looking wider, looking at some benchmarks, looking at best practice. There are opportunities to go further in these. And look, the last point is also one to bear in mind, and we'll have to work with that today if there are changes, but these reviews do come up with an integrated package of recommendations. There is a little page in each of those, the little bubble diagram sort of thing, which does show the interrelationship between some of the recommendations. If the recommendations aren't accepted in full to go next stage, we might just have to examine as part of the implementation plan what the ramifications that might be, how we would alter the program, what we do differently, because they are a package of recommendations. More around how this has been done. So look, there is a small dedicated project team, and as already been mentioned, supplemented by independent subject matter experts. So that's not this existing team you see in front of you today. These were independent people that came in review by review to actually test, to challenge, to add their relevant expertise in those particular fields. We've also had a Te Ao Māori advisor who sits across the entire program, so that's one of the subject matter experts that will be consistent across all of our reviews. The Group CFO is lead officer and overall sponsor of this program. The independent reference panel, so 3 people of very, very high standing, and they are ensuring there's matters of consistency, reasoning, content, the process is robust, the inputs are being translated and understood appropriately. They've assisted a huge amount in getting the reports to the form they are today. Political Oversight Group, chaired by Councillor Clow, is that monitoring and consultation role. A representative group here, but we're obviously open for anyone to come along. And then the last one's also important is decision-making piece. It does come back to this committee, so there are those other groups involved, but ultimate decision-maker for which services will be reviewed, the terms of reference for those, and those recommendations as to whether they go to the next stage or not is coming to this committee in each case. That's what the mandate says, and that's the one that we'll follow. So as I say, that's two, really just a bit of a recap and a bit of an introduction. Probably I'll just hand over to Sally Garrett now just to talk a wee bit about the methodology that's been applied.
Thank you. Yes, so we are following a recipe for this value for money program, and that will give us a consistent and common way intrinsically to look effectively at the 3 things that we need to look at as part of Section 17A, which is governance, funding and service delivery, but also broader around value, value referenced against our need to review not only economically but also culturally, socially and environmentally. And so those are the values that we look at, and the method that we're basically adopting has 4 chunks. We start off with the terms of reference, which sets the scope and nature of the review and the lines of what we call the lines of inquiry. And then we move to a current state, which is essentially evidence-based. It looks at sources of evidence from financial and other empirical sources of data. It looks at, as Kevin has said, best practices. We go outside, look at the public sector generally and see what they're doing relative to what we're doing. And we also look at literature generally as well. So we look at plans and both forward and backward-looking plans. So we try and take a research-based approach to the review, using the evidence in front of us to draw observations and make those observations transparent and clear. In our ideal environment, we're always looking at what we characterise as, in sort of our parlance, investment logic. And by that, we're looking essentially at what outcome or objective or performance target is being sought by the investment in resources, both financial and human, and what plan is being applied to achieve those outcomes. So we're trying to look at this, if you like, trail of planning to see to what degree this logic is in place, and then see, once that investment's been made, what the outcome has been in relation to that investment, seeking that particular outcome objective. And in the main, that's our ideal review environment. And you'll see today that there's been, a couple of reviews that haven't had that ideal environment, perhaps most particularly the Three Waters, which we're recommending effectively the strategy be formed. So that's our operating environment for the reviews. And as we go through these reviews over time, you'll get, I hope, an understanding that we're applying this common approach across the reviews, and there's a recipe being applied. And the learnings that we're accumulating across the reviews will become apparent as well, as they have done in the covering note, where we've mentioned the need for work to be done on this so-called investment logic, making sure that it's very clear what performance targets, what outcomes or objectives are being sought from the investments being made, because that's not always apparent in terms of the performance framework, and that greatly aids effectively our evidence-based approach. So I'll pass you now.
Right, so just everyone's pretty familiar with this, surely, and this is basically the same approach is going to happen on all 30 of the reviews we're going to be doing. So there's no change, evidence-based, same methodology, etc., etc. So people all understand? Right, Three Waters, we'll go straight to Ross. We'll do the Three Waters presentation. So what we're going to do is, again, because we're not going to show recommendations up on the screen because there's going to be the presentation, that's why you need to look at page 43, 44 and 45. Ross. Oh, Daniel, sorry. You have a question?
Are we up to questions?
No, oh, no, sorry, I got told you had a question.
Presentation.
No? Okay, so Ross will... Three Waters, yep.
Thank you. I've got a few selected slides from the overall pack, which I'll just talk in general and to give you an overview of the Three Waters review. Three Waters, in the context of Auckland Council Group, is slightly different to the activities you'll find in the long-term plan. It picks up the water and wastewater services delivered by Water Care, and then the stormwater service delivered by the Healthy Waters Department within the council. So actually looking in a Three Waters perspective was actually pulling together and actually looking at waters across the council. One of the things we looked at through all our reviews is we looked at a number of best practice examples to try and understand learnings from other jurisdictions of where they've implemented Three Waters and what could be learned into a New Zealand context. In that first slide, the definition is from Melbourne Water, who've done a lot of work to move from a drain city to become much more, a water-sensitive city, which I'll talk about slightly in a wee minute. Three Waters is large. There's close to $13 billion worth of assets deployed in delivering the Three Waters services, and there's about $6 billion in capital expenditure planned for the next 10 years in the long-term plan. So it's big. There's networks. There's some commonality in the networks, particularly between the wastewater and stormwater, where there's pipes. There's some commonality in pipes, but we've got a big ecosystem across the council delivering the Three Water services. A few years, 3 years ago, the Stormwater Department undertook a bit of benchmarking work with the Cooperative Research Centre for Water-Sensitive Cities. And the diagram there is sort of showing and some things that maybe want to be considered when you implement a Three Water strategy. In that, some of the aspirational elements was Auckland being a waterware city, but actually the actions on the ground were actually very much of a drain city, which is not surprising given some of the history of Auckland and where Auckland is in terms of a Three Waters environment. But one of the key elements that we did find is, at the moment we don't have Three Waters and we're not managing in a Three Waters environment. We then started to look at, okay, so we can't look at this on a Three Waters basis, but what we did find was that significant value has been delivered since amalgamation into Auckland Council. Both Water Care, with the vertical integration of the water and wastewater services, and the Healthy Waters Department have delivered significant savings from what was planned by the Auckland Transition Agency in that first long-term plan for Auckland. There's been significant value. But we do believe that there is opportunities to build further on that value. At the moment, there is at the time of the review, there was no shared outcome for Three Waters, but now with the Safe Swim coming into play, we're starting to see outcomes and measures that we can actually then measure the Three Waters approach. But a key thing for us was finding is we do need that Three Waters strategy and policy to underpin any further activities in this area. And it is our sort of first recommendation, that work should commence on a Three Waters strategy and policy, as outlined in the Auckland Plan. Using the basis that savings were achieved from the original amalgamation into Auckland Council and looking at some international best practice, particularly the United Kingdom, who've done a lot of improvements around asset management approach, we believe that further savings can be achieved through amalgamating Three Waters in various aspects. We believe that there can be, if we join up three water strategy and planning, join up asset management planning, take a joint approach to procurement, there is the opportunity to unlock further value for Auckland. There's further opportunity for looking at how operations and maintenance are managed across the group and whether Watercare could take a greater role in that on behalf of Council, much the same as Manukau Water did on behalf of Manukau City Council. But we do come back to that we do need to see the strategy and policy in place on the basis that function will follow form. During the review, we had support from Steve Nye, who was our independent expert. Steve came from Tonkin and Taylor in Melbourne. And we did meet with Watercare's board to discuss the review findings, along with the management teams of both Watercare and Healthy Waters. In general, supportive, but very much clear that the strategy and policy needs to occur before more work can be done to unpick these value opportunities. We're happy to take any questions.
So, dealing with the issue of strategy and policy, don't have an issue with that. Just around peer review, the Water Sensitive Cities unit in Melbourne, I visited them some time ago in Melbourne. They certainly indicated that they were happy to be more engaged in Auckland Council. I just wonder whether it would be useful to have some insight from them around a review of what we're proposing. I'd invite a comment on that, and I say that because I know that that unit is part of a network range of units in a number of cities around the globe with an immense amount of experience that goes to water-sensitive cities. So that's my first question.
I mean, there well could be merit for engaging them and other experts as the strategy and policies developed.
Yep. Okay, and the follow-on question from that is, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're proposing is we deal with the strategy and policy first, the later things that go to asset management and locking everything in, that's a later consideration. We don't do that now?
On the basis that function follows form, we think it's sensible to get the strategy and policy in place first. There are some activities that could occur now in terms of some of the joint procurement activities. You could look at how maintenance was delivered, and some of the work around regulatory could occur prior to that, should the Council so choose.
Okay. Just another question, Mr. Chair. There is some evidence from other cities that going bigger and tying things in around procurement and the like doesn't necessarily lead to savings. In our model, particularly where we've got the local boards that sit alongside council, and we know that they have a very strong say in what happens, and obviously our communities have a significant amount of engagement. Is that something that you've taken into consideration in your recommendations?
We're not talking about the next value for money review. That is the next one.
Correct.
Group procurement.
And I am talking...
We are not talking about that today. We're talking about Three Waters.
And I'm talking about Three Waters, and I'm talking about the engagement of local boards in whatever we do moving forward and our communities.
We will have feedback when it comes back in February by the Chief Executive after working with, I see Ravine here, so we'll be working with, and Craig's here in the case of this, so that's when the feedback will come.
So just harking back to the first question I asked, Mr. Chair, and that is that there was a response that yes, we could engage the Water Sensitive Cities unit in Monash and elsewhere. I think it's highly desirable for us to do that as part of this process. So I just want to put that on the table and just ask whether we need any further move on the part of this committee to make that so.
I think it's the impression at the moment there's not going to be a review of the review. This is local government and we don't want to go there. So we're just trying to move on to the strategy. I'm sure we'll be informed
This is not a review of the review. This is talking about
Kevin.
strategy
Kevin.
and receiving some advice that could be very useful.
Kevin.
Yeah, through the Chair, just to clarify. So, yeah, what this is suggesting is the first stage is the Three Waters strategy as well as some other initiatives such as asset management procurement. If the implementation plan goes ahead, if this is accepted, these are the first step in that process. Part of the second step of actually developing the strategy will involve a lot of discussions, a lot of review about where best practice is, what it looks like, what we actually develop in the strategy, and the implementation of that strategy potentially could be the self-sustaining small environmental base schemes versus a large whole-scale one. That's the very, very purpose of the Three Water strategy.
So my question was around the involvement of organisations such as water-sensitive cities in the development of the strategy.
That's what Kevin just said.
Yep.
Councillor Newman.
Thank you. My question, and I referred firstly to page 95, it addresses the people who were interviewed or who participated in discussions relating to this review. Can I ask who participated from Veolia, how was Veolia engaged, and what input was received from Veolia?
Through the Chair, we had no engagement directly with Veolia.
Sorry?
Veolia. We had no engagement directly with Veolia. We engaged with Watercare, who managed that relationship on behalf.
With respect to page 73, I note that you estimate $61 million of savings over 10 years from consolidated capital planning, which addresses capital planning in the context of a Three Waters asset management plan. How would Watercare's function align with the franchise model that applies to Papakura and Franklin?
Through the Chair, I mean, we'd have to work through that detail as you actually create a joined-up asset management plan.
With respect to page 80, you're talking about the value proposition on page 80 is combined operations and maintenance. So the work stream outlines the value proposition around those things. Since some of the biggest stormwater investment in the Auckland region over the next 10 years will take place in the south, how would that franchise agreement shape your ability to achieve the alignment of operations and maintenance, given that there is a retail franchise agreement that's in place for decades affecting Papakura and Franklin areas where there's going to be some of the biggest stormwater investment?
I mean, again, that level of detail would have to be worked through. The value proposition is about actually getting much clearer planning between the three waters, and at the moment, three waters are not planned together. So actually starting to plan together, you actually need to tease out some of the issues that you're raising.
Moving forward, is there any process that will allow for input from Veolia, given that they do have the retail franchise function for water supply and wastewater affecting Papakura and Franklin, which is a contractual relationship?
That would have to be considered as part of doing that next stage of work. And you know, specific to maintenance, you know, Veolia currently have the obligation to maintain the asset that exists today.
Okay, Councillor Cooper.
One of my questions is around the idea alternative funding models like SPVs. Is the investigation being done, or will it carry on after this, as to actually who, you know, how the pay, you know, the actual cost is sheeted back to ratepayers anyway, whether that's more expensive, less expensive? I ask that because, I mean, if someone's going to fund an SPV, they don't do it on a philanthropic basis. They want a return. And, you know, I'd like to see, you know, is it going to be cost the ratepayers more in that vehicle than it would from being directly invoiced, say, by Watercare? I mean, you can't maybe answer it now, but those are the sort of things we need to look at because I don't think it's a magic bullet.
Yeah, look, no, through the Chair, I'm glad you added that last piece, because that's what it's all about, is when we start an investigation, if it's accepted that these are recommendations to follow up on, part of that would be the development of a full business case if it is suggesting a change to the operating model. That would actually weigh up the benefits, the costs. As was part of the introduction to this, this is not a cost-cutting exercise alone, so this is actually looking at the value for money aspect. So part of that is equity.
Yeah, thank you.
How
because
are people charged?
I think a lot of people think that this is all about that, but it's about value for money.
Yep.
So I hope the headline isn't that, that we said we'd save money and we didn't in the end of the day, because actually, and the other thing I wanted to ask is around stormwater. On the basis that, in my opinion, since amalgamation, we've underfunded stormwater. We tend to put things off, send them further away, so in that year we can look good with our rates. Is it based on what we should have spent or what we did actually spend operationally in capital? Because I think there's a big shortfall in what we should have done and what we did do. Because we're talking about we spend this much now, but it may not have been enough in the first place. We've got huge issues with combined stormwater and wastewater. So
that will come back as part of the...
No, well, I want to know if that was taken into account, Mr. Chairman. That's not something that should have been. I want to know that if you base what we're saying we made savings, but were they just savings to cut the rates that year, or did we just put them? We put them off, and we should have spent it. That's the reality.
Kevin.
Yeah.
Look, at a high level, and this will cover all of these reviews and future ones, fundamentally what it's saying is when we do spend money to achieve certain outcomes, is it actually achieving those outcomes and being effective? Is it also being the most efficient use of that dollar that's being spent? This is not fundamentally going back to political debate about how much money you want to spend on various services. It is actually tackling when you are delivering the service, are you delivering value for money when you are spending money on that service? There's another political discussion there around the allocation of funding.
Thank you.
Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is actually to the Mayor, if I may, that while I completely understand the strategic purpose here is to identify those opportunities for value for money, what I'm really wanting to come to grips with in a governance sense, given the responsibility that the Mayor has under the statute for governance, how this, and this will probably relate to those other reviews as we work through, just how he sees this fitting in his governance model in terms of where some, obviously the delegations for the work that must come back here, where it comes under performance through the Appointments Review Committee and through our CEO and the staff of the council. So just getting a bit of a headline for understanding how he sees this work stream progressing and what work will take place from within his office, because as I perhaps alluded to earlier, I was a bit confused when I was reading some stuff in the media and then bringing issues back here, and just where the work is being generated from, and also his confirmation that yes, other cities around New Zealand are undertaking these sorts of reviews, and that Auckland isn't the only one actually engaged in these value for money reviews.
Just so happens the Mayor is next, but I just want to clarify one thing. We are driving the reviews here. Okay, we've determined the next two, and then the ones that are proposed after that will come back to this committee and we will determine the priorities of them. So it's this committee that's driving the reviews.
No, but ultimately the governance...
The Mayor giving
I'm happy to answer the questions. In terms of the governance model, I regard value for money as a fundamental obligation of us as elected representatives. Is there anybody here that doesn't go back to their constituency and hear people raise questions about whether we do things as effectively and efficiently as we ought? And the answer is sometimes we don't know, and the value for money is an independent and external overseen process done by our professional staff that should give us and our ratepayers and residents confidence that we are looking for value for money and that that is an important part of our governance role. Now, secondly, how has it worked? We have the obligation under Section 17A of the Local Government Act 2002. When I've talked to our Chief Executive, he says, yes, Other cities are engaged in this, but we are probably more comprehensively and doing in more depth the range of value for money studies that are envisaged under the Act. We shouldn't apologise for that. We should be very proud of the fact that our city, which makes up 38% of GDP, is the first in the line to do this comprehensively and in depth, and acknowledge the Chief Executive Officer's role in that. I think the other point that is fundamental to this, and it maybe goes back to Councillor Cooper's question, is that we know with the growth of the city and the increased demand for services and the increased need for infrastructure, we currently don't have a revenue stream that allows us to meet those demands. So we need to be certain that for every dollar we spend, we are getting the best value for money from that dollar. If we do make savings of $300 million here, that is money that won't go back, to answer Councillor Cooper's other question. It's not about cutting rates. I wished I could promise that. I don't think it's likely. It's about making sure that the savings we make can be reinvested in the infrastructure we desperately need and the services that we are required to carry out for the 50,000 extra residents we're getting each year.
So supplementary to that, when it comes to the implementation and the role of the CEO down and staff, the performance of that, the review of that will then come to this committee.
That's correct.
And not to the Appointments and Review Committee. No,
the Appointments and Review Committee has a separate role to judge the performance of the Chief Executive and to make appointments. This will come back to Finance and Performance, as we agreed at the last meeting of Finance and Performance. And I just want to make this other point really clear. I pressed for value for money studies to take place under the Act, which requires us to do it anyway, but I wanted to do it comprehensively. But this process has been entirely conducted by our professional staff, and I want to acknowledge their professionalism and their high standards in doing it. It is judged also by subject experts in each area, and then the overall look at it is overseen by an independent review panel that enables us to be able to say when we meet our constituents, yes, our professional staff did it, with subject experts from outside and overview from top people in industry. So we should have confidence when we read these reviews, this and the other three, that the process has been thorough, that it's been objective, that it hasn't been politically influenced, and that it can be relied upon.
Thank you. I'll come back with some further questions a little later on the agenda. Thank you.
Wayne, wrapping up Three Waters, perhaps.
Sure.
Sorry,
So,
I had a question too.
I've got a question.
Okay,
in
right.
due course.
We'll take Wayne and then back
So,
to the Mayor.
just going back to the Three Waters, Mr. Chair, and obviously we've had some discussion around the policy and the strategy, and we're going to go to that, and that's going to be done. My concern is that around policy and strategy, we're talking about water as it applies to the whole region. For example, if you look at the City of Melbourne, they treat the city as a catchment, so that takes in all forms of water as it falls. So that goes to policy and strategy. When it comes to the follow-on, which is water and wastewater and stormwater, how we do things needs to reflect the way those things are dealt with by the community, their investment. Increasingly, if we look at disruption, and that is occurring across the energy space.
Looking for a question here, Wayne?
Yes, it's going to be possible and is possible for people to generate energy more economically than they can get it off the grid. These sorts of things are happening in the water space, the wastewater space and the stormwater space. So we need to take an open platform systems approach.
Still searching.
So my question is, if it comes to a question, are we going to embrace the private sector's ability to provide services that may compete, could be more cost effective than ours? At the household level, the ability of households to deal with things. So you've heard my question?
Yep.
So it's not just a myopic, internal
Councillor Walker.
value for money proposition.
Don't kill your question off.
Through the chair, that look hugely wide-reaching. The strategy fundamentally must consider all aspects of that, and look, that will be private sector. What requirements are put through regulation, through unitary plan process for healthy waters, what our own intentions are, what their strategy is. We've determined here as being appropriate outputs from that, and also I do have to say one of the big ones is also the notion that at the end of the day, council will be the default provider if the private sector determines to step out. So that's a big consideration for us. So look, all of that will be considered as part of the strategy process.
And the reason I mention that is there's no mention in here, Mr Chair, of any of these things that I'm putting, so I have to make the assumption they haven't been considered.
It's been noted through your question. Mayor Goff.
Not even.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. 3 quick questions. The first question is, given this is providing us with probably 80% of the savings in the first 4 value for money reviews, how confident are you that figure of $300 million in savings is a reasonable estimate of the potential savings in this area, and why?
Yeah. So as we said earlier, I mean, the estimates contained in the report are order of magnitude, so they are that. But what we've relied on is basically to support our estimates is the savings that were made from amalgamation, which were much greater, but we still believe there are some savings available, and the experience that we saw in the United Kingdom when they're now completed their 6th 5-year cycle of asset management planning, and by getting tighter and tighter and more robust in planning, they've been taking 10 to 20% savings each 5-year cycle out. So using lessons in other areas and applying them back, we believe there are savings there. But as we said earlier, the detailed work needs to be done. You know, so because both Water Care and the Healthy Waters Department have done a lot of good work and have made a lot of savings in this area. You know, so it's based on that maturity. But we believe if we create a more joined up 3 waters approach, the savings opportunities exist.
Thank you. I think if we've got a precedent and they've had that success, there's no reason why we shouldn't aspire to the same. The second question, if there is $300 million in savings to be found in this area, is it the purpose that this money should simply be reinvested straight back into 3 waters, or would that come via council to ensure we've got transparency over how the savings are utilised and what particular services we're providing? It may be slightly academic because we know that we've got another $6 or $7 billion we've got to invest in 3 waters, but I think it should be done in a transparent way. Is that the intention?
If I handle that one. Through the chair, there's a couple of key components here. One is the fact that Watercare are a self-funding entity. So depending on where these savings actually eventuate, may actually be driven partly by those funding mechanisms, be it through water charges or through the rates which apply to healthy waters. But look, ultimately, the decisions will have to come back to Board of Watercare through to this committee to decide those savings and where they're going to be applied. That won't be any strategy, any work done by this process will not talk about where those savings should now be utilised. That's not part of this program.
Thank you. Third and last question, Mr Chair. Stephen Nye, the subject expert from Tonkin Taylor, I understand he's done extensive work on 3 waters in Australia, but I just wanted to confirm whether or not that was correct.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, that might partly answer Councillor Wayne Walker's question about Melbourne. Thank you.
Only partly.
Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks, Mr Chair. Thank you, team, for this work. Given that Watercare and our Healthy Waters departments are large, they're also monopolies to a large degree, how have you been able to affect into your work the timeliness and the flexibility of an asset delivery program, bringing out $600 million a year? So part of the efficiency delivery is not just about dollars saved, it's also about effective timeliness of asset delivery. So how have you factored that into your work here?
Through the chair, I mean, the second recommendation really is getting to the heart of that, actually, for looking forward to get the plans more aligned in terms of sequencing and therefore delivery, which then actually supports the procurement processes. So we've very much taken a forward-looking view to that aspect.
Just a second, just if I came, Mr Chair. So our population growth's gone to record highs, you know, from a flat line position to a record high of 50,000. I have no idea what it's going to do going forward. It might tip down a bit. So that sort of has a big collateral capex component for us for delivery of new infrastructure into greenfields or uplifted or improved infrastructure into brownfields. So you talk about year-on-year flexibility. So with a capital program that's planned out 10 years in advance or further, that degree of flexibility is probably critical for efficiency. So it still comes into that sort of model you're talking about in that level. In that question too, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Councillor Holtz.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions, and I'm wondering whether in the review and the next stage of the review, when it comes back to us, consideration or discussion will be had around governance changes. And the reason why I ask that is for us to alter the way that water care manages itself and deals with these issues, we may need to have a structural change in water care to actually deliver some of these. Because I remember, and I quote, the now deceased Mark Ford saying he'd rather drink a cup of his own urine than accept stormwater management into water care. There is a very clear difference in the way that these two water management processes function. So for us to look at some sort of combined process, we would need to look at a governance change. Water care would either be destructured and brought into council as an arm of council, or we would have to fundamentally change the nature of a CCO to allow them to do stormwater, because there's not a funding stream for stormwater. So has that been, I've not really seen a kind of a joined up discussion in there.
Yes, so we did not, through the chair, draw any conclusions about the form of governance, because our thoughts were that the first step towards determining what the organisational form should be is to agree, essentially, the merits or otherwise of an integrated water management system. And that's going to obviously take place through the development of a policy and a strategy. And the organisational form will follow, essentially, the agreed outcomes and objectives from that strategy. So we did kick that particular evaluation for touch because we felt that the strategy was the bedrock upon which effectively any organisational form was going to be developed, and therefore we have made a recommendation in the body of the report that governance be considered after the strategy or the policy and strategy is known. Just to elaborate a wee bit further, there needs to be an understanding of what's being sought. Is it going to be predominantly water quality? Is it going to be on water quantity? Is it going to be on cost efficiency? Is it going to be on flood resilience and climate change? What are effectively the dominant outcomes being sought from a three-water strategy for Auckland? Or actually, of course, this has been superseded now by an Auckland water strategy, which takes in more than the three waters. It takes in other forms of water. So until that policy is, and those policy settings are known, we couldn't really recommend the organisational form.
Thank you. I've got a second question, Mr Chair, but thank you for that excellent answer, Sally, and we're on exactly the same page when it comes to an Auckland water strategy. Mr Chair, that was the reason why I was so keen that we had the holding recommendation in the middle, because some of these recommendations imply our ability to be able to deliver, but with form following function, some of these can't be delivered without a form change in the governance. So we just need to be really honest about that. My other issue, and the Mayor's asked half my question around to what will we apply the savings, and he quite rightly said we can't spend savings because they are by their very nature savings. And I think Councillor Sayers is well known for that question. So the reality is on page 47, we need to be very cautious about the reporting of this so-called 300 million. We have a much bigger requirement in that if we are going to deal with the outcomes of what Safe Swim is demonstrating to us. So whilst we may be able to haul money out of, and we should be able to haul money out of the spend here, we have got a very big bill the other side. So I think caution needs to be applied to that. And my final question is somewhere in here, it might be very deep within the report, the reality is the way that we will find savings in stormwater is to fully integrate the way that we plan ahead and not build pipes. And I just want, I guess, some reassurance, Mr. Chair, that we aren't looking at sort of structural pipe-based stormwater, that the savings are just in doing more joined up and integrated planning.
Here.
Ross, would you agree?
Personally, I would agree, but I've got no comment on the engineering with the stormwater.
Okay. I have Councillor Casey and then Councillor Newman with questions.
One of my questions has been asked and answered. The other is, you went to the Water Care Board. Did they formally resolve to participate, or do we not need a formal resolution?
There was no formal resolution of the board.
So can you just talk us through how they received it? What's the biggest risk they perceive for their company?
So through the chair, I mean, we discussed the report in draft and the recommendations with the board. The feedback from the board has generally followed some of the debate here today, in that they saw that the strategy and policy was the most important thing, and then form would follow function. The board are also concerned about their role as a board, and and hence just the sequencing of recommendations, that anything that comes out of committee, there is a governance process that has to be considered for Water Care as its own entity with its own board and its own chief executive to work through.
What was their main risk that they saw in this?
I don't think that we know the answer to that. That's really for them to understand their risk position. But I can confirm that that they are generally supportive of the value for money reviews, and they have been, both management and board, receptive and engaged in the process. And they are strong supporters. I think I can say that without representing their position.
Sitting behind you, better watch.
Yeah, of the need for a strategy, of a policy and a strategy.
Yep, and we certainly haven't heard Ravine make a statement that he endorses what Mark Ford said about the integration. So we're assuming. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. The report, page 55 of the report, addresses the section 57 price regulation, which is unique to water care, the overall cost of water supply and wastewater services in relation to minimum levels of pricing. That value proposition, can I just ask, is that value proposition in the context of this review so far, is that based on the application of that same principle extended to stormwater? Because the Act is clear, it relates to water supply and wastewater services. I would like to understand, are you trying to model that same principle across three waters?
Yeah, through the chair, I mean, one of the recommendations is around economic regulation, in that you do have monopoly service providers. Water Care have the legislative requirement, which we believe could be tested further through some form of economic regulation, and if that were to occur, to extend it to stormwater, to look at anything we do in a joined-up three waters manner.
Can I suggest that the section 57 needs to be read carefully, because it does specify water supply and wastewater services. It doesn't leave open just minimum pricing. It addresses water supply and wastewater services. It doesn't address all parts of the business beyond that. So I think that and I'll come back to it, Mr. Chair, later, but I think it's very important, and I'd like to get some clarity as to how that principle applies if you're looking to extend Watercare's function beyond what is set out in that particular and unique piece of price regulation.
Kevin?
Yeah, it's similar to the responses before. It's probably too early to state that because the combination of these services into one place could well be on a contractual basis. So, for instance, water pricing and council is paying Watercare to provide stormwater services, be it maintenance and operating. So it's too early to state exactly what the implication would be. By having it on that page, what we're very conscious of is these are legislative requirements that must be met when we actually consider the strategy, and ultimately, if the strategy is adopted, what form may follow that? What may the actual operating model look like afterwards? So we're consciously aware of all those, so they'll be considered as part of those discussions, or as part of those considerations, I should say.
Reserve my right to speak.
Thank you, Kevin. Councillor Quax, last question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When those of us who were on the Legacy Manukau Council will recall that at that time there was a change from the council-run Three Waters to Manukau Water, which ran Three Waters. So, what learnings have we taken from that? Was there a cost saving? Was there a better level of service? What learnings came from that?
Through the chair, yeah, certainly we have spoken to a number of people involved in that transaction and service delivery, and we used it as a case study in the basis of the report as a model that was believed to be, the operation of stormwaters was contracted to Manukau Water by Manukau City Council, and it was believed to be an efficient and effective way of running. Manukau Water ran the wastewater and the stormwater services as a single business unit, and then water services as a business unit was how it was organised in practice.
Okay. So, to answer my question, were there any cost savings as compared to what the Legacy Manukau City Council did when it ran the Three Waters and when it was run by a CCO? And was there an improved level of service? Did we find that out?
There were savings at that time. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. Mr. Chairman, can I also ask you a question around the recommendations here? Because I noticed that, and if we can go back to those recommendations, I can ask that question now.
Okay. What do you want to go
is
to?
Is procurement on? Was procurement on that? Part of that three of those recommendations on page 43.
Page 45. Yep.
Okay.
What follows?
So I'm somewhat concerned that we have, in conjunction with Watercare and Auckland Transport, immediately form a single procurement centre. I'm particularly concerned about that, given what has happened with the procurement around Project 17. And how badly that seems to have been mishandled. And here we are deciding that we're going to have a procurement centre of excellence operated by Watercare or Auckland Council. And I'm not sure if I'm prepared to vote for that.
Okay. Oops. So all we're doing is endorsing this to go to the Chief Executive to come back with a strategy.
Well, actually, if you read that number 3, joint procurement, it doesn't say that.
Okay, well, we just didn't really want to get into rewording all the recommendations made by...
It's a good question, Dick.
The entity that's been investigating for us. It's going to come back in February, and we are already doing some group procurements happening anyway, and it includes Watercare working with us on group procurement. That is happening. We're advancing that as we go. So if we get into changing the wording on all the recommendations, to be honest, we'll be here for days.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's vitally important, and the provision of water to the city is vitally important. And if we have a procurement hiccup, as we have had with the procurement of around Project 17, that could be fatal to the reputation of the city.
Bottom line is, if we change one word, we're not endorsing the recommendations. It's as simple as that. So at the moment, we're just trying to endorse the recommendations for the strategy to come back to see as whether they're feasible. Let me just sum it up as briefly as that, okay? Strategy to come back to see about the feasibility.
Mr. Chair, just
Yeah,
a point. Do we have a one-page we can go on the screen that shows the headline recommendations that covers all, or is it spread out throughout the whole thing, is it?
Sorry, what was that?
So we initially had some A to C recommendations. I think now it goes to F. Do we have those on one page, which might give the councillors some clarification and certainty about the intention of what is proposed here?
Well, simply because we just don't have enough pages. That's why I've been telling people to go to page 43, because it's the exact wording.
But it's the initial recommendations that's the important part here. That tests feasibility.
Yeah, we haven't got the...
You haven't got that on one page, have we? No.
That's at odds with the words.
We hear what you're saying, Councillor Quack. We have Councillor Darby. Last question.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the Three Waters strategy and policy that's recommended, it appears like this is a brand new direction, but the former Watercare, and also the suggestion that, Watercare's CEO actually resisted this, but Mark Ford, deceased, he actually, my recollection is he actually signed off on the Three Waters strategic plan. His signature is on that document. So and it's a pretty extensive document, it's some 70 pages. In your scanning or discovery, did you discover that 2008 strategic plan? And can you briefly explain what is the difference between a Three Waters strategy and policy, and I emphasise the linkage that you're focusing on there, and that 2008 Three Waters strategic plan?
So the 2008 Three Waters strategy was initiated by Watercare, and it didn't involve any public consultation. It was really an internal process of development, along with the then legacy councils, water operations. Remember, in 2008 there was a split between retail and wholesale. So it was Watercare as the wholesaler, and then the councils as retail. It's very light on the stormwater. It's accepted that it's light on the stormwater analytics, and it was never subject to public consultation or submission. And in our recommendations, we're making, in the body of the recommendations, we think that it's timely for the public to be involved in these public policy settings, because it goes to water quality and the quality of harbours and safe swim, and that deserves essentially, in our view, some public involvement.
Okay, thank you, Sally.
So, Councillor Quacks, we're just having a little quick... we're going to... The mover and the seconder, we've both agreed to change the wording from immediately form a single procurement centre of excellence to state evaluate the formation of a single.
That would resolve my
right. And then it's consistent with paragraph 27. So thank you for that. Right, now questions are over. We're on to comment. Alf, did you have a question?
The only thing I have is just the nodding of the head in regards to the 2008 report from Watercare, saying that it was wrong, the comments that were made. So, I mean, I would like to at some stage, and not here, because I don't think this is the forum to end up getting thrown here and backwards and forwards in regards to no, you're wrong around the consultation with the 2008 Watercare strategic plan around the community consultation. So I just wanted to raise that. Then hopefully we'll get something from Watercare if there is any dispute around what's been said. I think it's important without sort of doing it now.
Right, well, I'm going to put up the resolutions A and B, so that will be just obviously the receiving of all the reports, which is A, and B is endorse the recommendations contained in the following 4 value for money reports, and then we're talking about three waters here. So A, we'll just put up B so that we're quite clear. And we have changed the wording. We can, yep, evaluate the formation, Councillor Cracks. Okay. So we have A and B, mover and seconder. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Against?
No.
Okay. You want it recorded, whoever that was?
Sure.
Aye?
Happy.
You want to record against it? Okay.
See, we've taken up American spelling now.
Right, we're now going to go on to domestic waste, and we have Jean-Pierre. Thank you.
Okay. This review covered domestic waste services, which covers collection and disposal, some ownership and management of various facilities, and education type services. Overall, we found that this set of services was informed by very clear strategy. Its implementation plan and operations are very well aligned. It's got good procurement processes, and there's competition among providers, which gives confidence that there's economy in waste collection. There's also evidence of proactive engagement with Maori and in line with the Maori responsiveness framework. And when we compare the operational costs to 2016 compared to what was forecast pre-amalgamation, it indicates cost savings as well. At the same time, customer satisfaction has risen. Customer satisfaction with the service has risen over time, and progress has been made towards the zero waste goal, with household waste per capita down about 10% and with increased diversion. So that paints a pretty good picture of that service, but we still see for the future some opportunities to improve value. So one of the key opportunities for the next waste management and minimization plan, which is being prepared, is to focus on the total waste stream. And that's because domestic waste is only 14% of the total tonnage going to landfill each year. And the non-domestic waste stream is also forecast to grow about 80% over the next 20 odd years. So that's one of our proposals, our recommendations, is to focus more on the non-domestic waste stream. Linked to that is a proposal to make use of site waste management plans, perhaps as part of the consenting process, to get businesses more involved and more businesses involved in minimizing waste to landfill. Obviously, this will need to be designed carefully with business to make sure it's as easy as possible and to avoid unjustifiable costs and other barriers to development. There's also an opportunity to further strengthen business disciplines. So there are good business disciplines in place, but there are further opportunities there. For example, the council owns and operates some waste facilities, and we recommend that the strategic and commercial case for that be reviewed. For example, non-strategic assets could be sold or leased out, which would help reallocate operational risks to providers and would help rely on private sector initiative and capital to deliver value. A number of our recommendations are also about being more disciplined in terms of the economic case and more proactive on seeking co-funding from the contestable government waste minimisation fund. So some of those recommendations play to that. So another set of recommendations is about lifting the economic discipline, and that's being able to do more to show more rigorous cost-benefit analysis. In particular, there's an opportunity to prepare more evidence on the external environmental, social, economic and cultural costs of waste going to landfill, which will help clarifying what zero waste means in practice, the value of diversion and so forth. That would also feed into clarifying whether or not the council should advocate the case for central government to increase the landfill levy, which would be done to increase the cost of disposal and so encourage diversion. The additional cost on Auckland households and businesses that they would impose could only be justified if these extra costs reflect the external costs of landfill, and hence that proposal to do more on lifting economic discipline and getting that evidence base. Finally, we recommend that the planned consolidation of waste collection contracts that's being planned be used as an opportunity to test outcome-based contracts. And the idea is that that would give ways to give waste collectors incentives to offer innovative retail and advisory service to help waste minimisation rather than simply collect waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Can you just tell me a bit more about the non-strategic waste management assets that we own?
There's a page 149, I think it is. So the council owns a transfer station. It's involved in a joint venture, and so I'm just trying to get the page. Yeah. So it's got. It owns 2 transfer stations.
Pages up?
This is page 135. It owns a materials recovery facility, recycling depot, and it's in a joint venture on a landfill.
And we're about to open a new recycling centre in the central region.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Within the next year.
Yep. Hopefully.
Yeah. So these are included in your divestment plans or the review of potential divestment?
So as part of the 2012 waste management plan, those were assets that were decided were worthwhile having a stake in. We are suggesting that the case for that could be reviewed.
What's the value of those non-strategic assets?
I don't have that at my fingertips.
Roughly?
Yeah.
Roughly?
Not terribly much, but...
What's that mean?
I don't have those figures at my fingertips.
Evan?
Yeah, no, I don't. But just testing the language as well. Yeah, this is not a divestment plan. This is actually just testing the value for money being delivered through those.
Nasty, suspicious mind. I see divestment.
That's why I thought I'd clarify, yes.
Testing divestment. Are we also testing in-house provision?
Yes, look, yeah, no, that's definitely part of it, yeah. So looking at how these are delivering, I mean, it may be that we actually find out there's best case practice coming through these mechanisms. So is there an opportunity to extend ourselves further there? So in-house, outsource, all sorts. Yep, no.
That's not highlighted in here anywhere.
Okay, okay.
That's good, just make sure you always say that.
Yes,
That's
okay,
good.
no, point taken.
Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker.
Sure. I'm looking at the recommendations. There's a mention here, quantifies wider environmental and other damages caused by landfill. I'm making the assumption that landfill includes what might be termed sometimes clean fill landfill. So it's looking at landfill in total.
There are different classes of landfill. This doesn't particularly look at clean fill, it looks at landfill that receives domestic waste.
Okay. Through you, Mr Chair, I would suggest that there are significant environmental and other damages that go to clean fill, the transport costs, the fuel costs. I could go on, and there are question marks over clean fill landfill. I think it's vital that clean fill landfill be looked at, Mr Chair. And clean fill also provides potential fill to apply in areas where we are going to need to lift assets because of sea level rise and other issues. So it's vitally important that we take a joined-up approach across council.
Thank you.
So that's one question I've got. The other question I've got is just around the approach, because quite obviously an increase in the waste levy changes the whole game as far as commercial and industrial waste is concerned. So are we going to take a scenario-based approach in terms of what we're dealing with in the next 12 months in terms of developing strategies?
So the domestic waste services team has done extensive work on various scenarios about what might be done here. The recommendations here are questioning the case for increasing landfill and suggesting further work be done rather than taking that as a strategy to take forward.
But the increase in the waste levy goes equally to commercial and industrial waste and has a massive effect around that, and that's most of the waste that frankly we're doing very little about. So my question is, are we going to examine that thoroughly and look at a range of scenarios and what is being proposed over the next 12 months?
That is what the recommendation suggests.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
Councillor Newman.
Thank you. I start from the perspective of I believe that we've done about as much as we can at this point in the domestic space, and strongly believe we need to be focusing on the commercial. With respect to the value proposition for site waste management plans, set out on page 155 onwards, you've given an overall rating of proceed with caution, and have referenced the UK review found that mandating plans impose compliance costs without changing behaviours or outcomes, and reverted back to voluntary plans. Is the concern here the compliance cost issue? Because I can tell you every week I see the cost of commercial waste externalised on the community through dumping, and that's appalling. So is a primary consideration here a compliance cost on business who are generating waste?
The recommendation is what it says. It's proceed with caution. There are opportunities to increase waste diversion by businesses, but the way you do it can be harmful. So it's walking a fine line and finding the right mechanism to do that. Increased red tape and cost on business would be harmful and might be counterproductive. At the same time, the growth in non-domestic waste suggests that that council will want to proceed on ways to increase diversion there.
If the primary focus is to really target that commercial waste because of the growth in the quantum of waste from business industry, wouldn't it, doesn't it go to the essence of the argument that we actually do need to confront this issue and get business to understand and to start to wear the consequences of some of these behaviours, including the negative externality of generating waste from construction, for example, and that there is a value in actually requiring a plan to address that?
The proposal in our findings are that more needs to be done on the non-domestic waste side, but be careful how you go about it.
Councillor Holmes.
Yeah, there's some good stuff in here. There really is, and I don't want to get picky because this is my area of passion, but I will. I've just got 3 questions just to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. And I just want to start with the non-strategic asset issue that Councillor Casey raised. I don't know if there is, or are you aware of the fact that we're actually purchasing or leasing other pieces of land to set up more community waste recovery centres? Because that's actually a policy decision of the council.
Yes, the suggestion we've got here is that the strategic case for that be reviewed.
Be reviewed.
Okay.
There's an approach. There's ownership of assets, facilities, and so forth now. The question is whether that is whether council needs to be involved in those particular assets, and whether there's a better way of using resources.
I think what I was trying to get at, Mr. Chair, is are we just talking about the asset, the land, or are we talking about let's look at the value case for using community entrepreneurs and community groups to recycle, to employ people, to make money, to reduce waste to landfill? I'm not too sure which business case you're looking at.
It's the asset, my understanding, it's the asset. Kevin?
It's the thing, is it the bit of land?
So we're not going to buy it now?
Oh, look, yeah, can I just draw this up to a certain level? There's, look, we opened the entire discussions back in March, which was that we're not going to, this review is not going to rewrite strategies and policies.
Exactly.
This is about the delivery of strategies and policies, but running parallel to all, this organisation's, you know, it's been going for 7 years, its predecessors have been going much, much longer. Things happen on pass. People are running processes. They're doing the best they can. They're drafting strategies and policies and operating. This is now a little thing sitting alongside those, which is doing a value for money assessment against those. It's not going to rewrite the strategies and policies. It's saying, are we delivering the maximum value for money and how we deliver on those strategies and policies? What it is going to do, though, sometimes is actually raise these points. Let's test those mechanisms. Let's test those individual recycling depots and those drop-off points. Are they actually delivering the value we thought they were? If they are, should we have more of them? If not, is it the right outcome? But potentially against that is also, are there other mechanisms to do that? If that is the right outcome for doing that, should council be the one that provides it, or is there an entity out there that's running some of them on a franchise basis that could do it for us? It's opening up all those sorts of discussions on a value for money basis as to how it's being delivered. It is not fundamentally going back and looking at the waste management minimisation policy. Admittedly, number 1 is pointing out, rather than focusing on domestic, should we be actually looking at the 86% of waste to landfill that's generated by commercial and industrial? But it's still not going to rewrite policies or strategies. It is sitting alongside those and talking about is it value for money and how they're being delivered right now.
Okay. And I think, Mr. Chair, that in the next iteration of this discussion, there's value for money, there's impact on the environment, there's social and cultural outcome. So this needs to reflect the 4 well-beings, and I'll keep repeating that. My second question is, are you aware, and I know it's always bad to start that way because then I'm going to make a point, are you aware that the Government Waste Management Fund is actually administered by the government and then we apply to that? I'm just really worried, and that's an annual fund and it's for big national issues. By putting the requirement in for us to immediately introduce a funding principle that no new waste management or minimisation service trial is to be approved without, and then there's a whole lot of things we have to do, I'm just worried, and this is one of the examples, small as it is, Mr. Chair, where I think we've fundamentally got it wrong. So I don't think that the group has understood the Waste Management Fund appropriately, and I'd just like you to address that. But secondly, it just seems to me that this is a complete doubling up of areas where it could potentially cost us money rather than save us money. I'll get them all out. My third question is the other one, which is a potential cost rather than the savings, is we've done all the work on the waste levy, on increasing the waste levy. We've had it reviewed by Wastemans, you know, the industry group, and we've got the support of the other councils. I'm not too sure, and perhaps you can explain why we will do that work all over again. Wouldn't we just take that piece of work to the government and say, it's time, do it, put up the levy? Can't see why we'd spend more money doing it all again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. On
the last point about increasing the waste levy, the key point there is that it would result in increased costs on households and businesses, quite considerably so. that is fine if we know that the benefits from doing that, the environmental, cultural, social, economic benefits of that, outweigh those costs. From what I have seen, reading through the material that informs those thoughts, that doesn't exist. So that's why the suggestion is to do further work to provide that evidence to support, or indeed work out that it isn't a good way to go. But you can only do that with the evidence, that economic evidence that we're suggesting. On the first question about our awareness of the Waste Minimisation Fund and how it works, we are aware of it and we understand how it works. So the suggestion here is to try and get co-funding for new waste initiatives from that Waste Minimisation Fund, which is a contestable fund. Sometimes that may well involve encouraging businesses and organizations, social organizations, NGOs and so forth, helping them participate in that contestable fund, because it's a fund that has been underutilized so far.
And I think, Mr Chair, thank you for that answer. I think we've been successful, but we can only apply. We can't force the government to then give us the money to do this. So we've put in a lot of applications. We've had some very good results. But I think, again, this is something we're being made responsible for. If the government, with the administrators of the fund don't give it to us, it's hardly a KPI for us.
Councillor Howells. Councillor Cooper.
I think a lot of those questions have been answered for me. Thank you.
Councillor Walker, you have one brief question.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, and that is the reference to the UK and the UK experience. That goes to the early discussion around water, and I see you've got it also in waste, and I just wonder why you're not looking at best practice in Europe. Japan, for example, that's probably the country that's leading around recovery in the commercial industrial waste sector. The experience in the UK has not always been a very good one.
Yep, wait a minute.
So I just want to raise that question.
Councillor Walker,
and the other question...
You're almost answering your question. A response to your question.
Yes, please.
Because you part answered your own question.
The best practice that's quoted is based on a literature review that was commissioned from REMU and the input of our expert advisor that was commissioned to be advising us as part of this review.
Sure. And the other question just goes to the mention you make about increased costs on households and businesses as a consequence of increasing the waste levy. Does that take into account all the externalised costs that businesses and households are effectively paying, environmental, social costs, pollutant costs and the like? Are you taking that into account in that comment?
The recommendation points out that, under the paper, that increasing landfill levy would have an estimated cost of those orders of magnitude on households and businesses. What we don't know is what those external costs are, the environmental, health, cultural costs are, that could be avoided and may be avoided by increasing the landfill levy.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Right, and Councillor Walker, just go to on the executive summary, page 11 and number 6 there, just so you're quite clear on how this, we've found that evidential base. And one of them is literature. So, right. So we have the recommendations. I've got no one here who said he wants to actually speak to them, so we're going to put the recommendations. Moved and seconded. So we've C, and it's the same preamble as normal as the others. So it's. I'll put that. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Against?
No. I'm happy with most, but not all, Mr Chair.
You don't want to show solidarity and just note the things you're against? Or
I'm happy to do that if I can supply my notes after, Mr Chair. And I'm actually happy to do that with the prior motion.
So do you want us to change it so that you've endorsed it, but we're noting some of your concerns then?
Yes, please.
Okay, because I think it would be better to show solidarity. It would be good. Would be good. Right, we're moving on to the next one, and Sally is going to lead on comms and engagement.
He's entitled to his views.
totally lies.
It's okay if he gets no.
So the services covered by the Communication and Engagement Review included brand marketing and channel management, research, consultation and engagement, public affairs and media communications, internal communications and operational communications and engagement and organisational support across the parent and the CCOs in part, and included both statutory and non-statutory service activities. Some key facts in respect of this particular service is that the operating expense, total operating expense for communications and engagement services is 46.5 million per annum, and a total of 239 full-time equivalent staff service this area. The operating costs, as you can see, are divided below. And against this, targets are being sought. We've basically put the council parents performance framework in place. These are the outcomes I've referred to earlier, where investment is being sought in achieving the performance targets. Some key facts for the service. It's a very, very extensive service environment, very complex, with lots of activity. There's a lot of statutory and non-statutory consultation taking place, and just to give you a snapshot, there's some key facts across the top in terms of the actual service activities. So very large volumes of website visits, large numbers of submissions received and feedback being processed, with lots of consultations, 46 plus consultations. In terms of the key findings, it should be recognised that this particular service is undertaken to support the CCO parent operating model. So the council-controlled organisational model works on the basis of, independent activities. And so this support service, in essence, is designed to operate with significant independence, including communications, as each organisation has distinct mandates, objectives, budgets and performance objectives. And when we talk to the CCOs in particular, there was a strong emphasis that this particular service, in cases of like water care and Auckland Transport, provided strong chief executive support in moments of crisis or event for what are called so-called lifeline utilities. So it's a very much a service that supports management in going about their roles. We saw, in respect of this review, an opportunity to develop a group communication strategy, and have recommended that be the case, particularly in relation to group reputational risks in cases. I mean, in the civil defence area, the protocols are well developed, but they're less developed in relation to incidents and events that are less than civil emergencies, where each organisation needs to come together and act collectively for the public good. So our sense was that in relation to those risks and those issues that arise in those circumstances, protocols would be a useful first step in the development of the strategy. And there were other things that we recommended be looked at by the communications management group in developing that strategy, including opportunities for joint procurement and opportunities for sharing performance outcomes, particularly we think in relation to engaging with Māori, which is a common activity across the service. We think that also in relation to looking at what we call the cost effectiveness aspect of the review, that there are some management practices that could be deployed more proactively to demonstrate and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of funding the service delivery. And that would include, particularly for the parent, a more formal strategic planning process. We looked at the UK public sector to get a sense of what management practices were, and we relied effectively on our subject matter expert. And this is an area where there is a lot of so-called disruption in the way service is delivered, and a very fast-moving set of changes around moving from print channels to digital channels, and reducing effectively the cost of printing, and there's a lot of activity in relation to the social media side of things as well. When we look back at what efficiencies had been delivered, and incidentally all the organisations were grappling with this disruption of moving from broadcast and print type approaches to this new digital social media approach, and some of the organisations are moving faster than others in this regard. In relation to value being delivered, we found that the establishment of the internal design studio by the parent and by Auckland Transport had developed or achieved some efficiencies. And we also, looking forward, could see through the supplier base and through the contract resourcing pool an opportunity to share some resources, and we suggested that that be looked at too in relation to group strategic planning. I think we've made it clear when we did a deep dive, what we call a deep dive into engagement with Māori, that was an area where improvement could take place demonstrably, and made a lot of suggestions around how that could potentially be improved. But it is also an opportunity for group collaboration in terms of improving iwi satisfaction across the region.
Right. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm interested in one thing here, and that is, do we have a percentage breakdown in the work time or people involved in statutory as compared to non-statutory communications?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so I couldn't find it, no.
We didn't go to that level of detail.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Filippania.
Thank you, Chair. Look, you've gone over to the UK most of the time in regards to the previous two of the four. So did you find out over the UK a comparable organisation the size of Auckland Council and how much they spend on comms and that?
Yes, I mean, in terms of benchmarking, we benchmarked the costs against the public sector in New Zealand in the main, and you'll see that in the body of the report that our costs sit in the midpoint range.
Just wanted to confirm it's around mid.
Yes.
And you didn't go overseas to find anything else comparable to the size of Auckland Council and how much they spend?
we didn't look at expenditure. We looked at
across the ditch.
We looked at the sort of way. Yeah, we did look at cities like Manchester, San Francisco, Vancouver, and other cities for management practices rather than costs. It's very difficult to actually find through public sources anyway those costs.
Thank you.
Councillor Casey.
I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I'll have a go. Sally, one of your early slides looks at trust, and current trust in council is at 17%. The target for this year is 20%, so we're under the 20% target. I was in the room recently with the police down in Manukau, who are in the higher 90s for trust. And the word trust comes up throughout this report here. What kind of things will the review be looking at that will increase, through communications and consultation, trust in council? And what things are we doing that we shouldn't be doing that would increase people's trust in council?
So I think that's probably best answered by management, because
that's fine, Kevin.
Our review was looking at 17A aspects, so we weren't questioning the targets or questioning the results.
For an elected member, that has to be right up there. You know, that's why we spend this money. We want people to believe in us, that we're doing the right thing, spending your money wisely. Kevin.
Oh, look, through the chair, I think you've had presentations in the past by trusts from some of the officers, and you'll know there are many factors that lead to trust, including the political environment, decision-making in this very chamber. Some of the factors that led to that was the transparency of the decision-making process, people understanding about how they actually participate with council and actually have their input adding value to the decision-making process. Some of the key drivers there. Look, lots and lots of factors. What it's really recognising here is that the Communication Engagement Department has a bit of a leadership role to play in advising about how to improve the trust through the business, through the political aspects. So comms and engagement themselves don't actually directly influence it, but they have many tools that can help. And some of those tools are the consultation process, the advertising events. It's that list of all the things that comms and engagement involve here. Most of those can contribute to increased trust in some way.
And there was a sentence, and I haven't been able to find it again, but in here you'll remember where it is, Sally, about the CCO's role in linking what they do with trust in the council.
Yes, we have made a recommendation in this report.
You remind me where it is and what it is, and
yes,
tell
so
my colleagues, because I thought it was a good one.
It will be in the value proposition development for a group strategy at... page 225.
Well done.
We've basically made the suggestion that as part of the group strategy development, that the senior communication management put that on the agenda, the planning agenda, to see whether trust and council could be shared by effectively the group.
It has to be.
At the moment,
it has to be.
Yeah, at the moment, it is a parent council performance measure. It's not a performance measure that's actually in the communications strategies and plans ubiquitously. I mean, Auckland Transport does have a trust in Auckland Transport measure,
yeah,
but it doesn't have a trust
council.
And council measure. And that was something we observed and suggested that as part of the group strategy they look at.
Fantastic. Delighted to see that. Long time coming.
Councillor Hills.
Thank you. I have a few questions. The first, considering ways we've made savings in this area before, and it's mentioned that we should continue that, is, say, bringing more design work in-house and taking away external agency. And obviously over 4 years that saved us $4 million, but to do that we had to increase the number of staff to save that $4 million per year because we're doing everything in-house. Was there suggestions on these other ways of making money? Was there suggestions that job cuts was one way to do that?
So the report does not make a recommendation about cutting jobs. what it does make the suggestion about cost efficiencies are twofold. One of them is to be more aggressive in the conversion of print and broadcast channels to digital and social media channels where the costs are lower than, and that was a suggestion. And the other recommendation is in relation to greater group procurement in terms of shared suppliers, where we have identified that there are common suppliers across the group in areas such as market research. We've seen, for example, Colmar Brunton is a common supplier across the group, to use an example, and we believe that there's opportunity for single contracting and sharing across the group to get essentially scale economies.
When you're talking Auckland Council parent, the 21 local boards, in my experience, asking for more and more communication and engagement, activities, events, posters, booklets, every time they upgrade a park, want more and more information because the community is requesting that. Did you talk to the local boards, or did you work with them to see what kind of comms and engagement they expect to be on the ground and staff-wise?
So these reviews are management reviews. We don't go to essentially customers and suppliers and have a dialogue with them. That's not part of the method. Because effectively, we're keeping the review tightly time-boxed and managed, and that would be complicated. So we did not speak to the local boards in relation to our recommendations, but we would expect the local boards would be involved in the evaluation and feasibility of these recommendations, if it was relevant to their area.
Cool. When we go into the area of CCOs, so say regional facilities, they already raise 70% of their income not from rates, and they're increasing that this year. They're wanting to increase their revenue outside of council by 20%. And sort of the obvious way is through marketing, and I think most of their comms and engagement is marketing for events, their venues, ticket sales. How do you see them reducing that spend when we're asking them to earn more money outside of, I'm confused about how we enable the CCOs to earn more money from commercial revenue, but we ask them to reduce potential marketing spend.
So we're asking for efficiency savings. We're not basically asking them to cut the costs of generating income and growth and funding growth. We're asking them to be more efficient in their operations. And you could say that, by growing their revenue by 20%, they can essentially achieve some of those cost efficiency savings through revenue generation rather than cost reduction.
And the movement to, I think it's good, movement to online social media, and we have seen a massive increase in that over the last 4 years, 5 times the number we had on some of our social media channels 4 or 5 years ago. But from putting an article in a paper compared to how do you see us reducing costs? It may be cheaper to advertise, but the labour intensiveness of running social media accounts 24/7 almost, how do you see the mix between being able to do that? Obviously, selling ads is more expensive. But.
So, again, these are management decisions, but we have observed and we have been advised by our expert that, savings of up to 25%. Manchester, by doing that aggressive, let's turn everything that we print off and let's go digital for everything, has saved them, in excess of 25% of their marketing spend.
But does that marketing spend include staff costs? Because as I can see it, it's the spend on online as opposed to putting ads in the Herald.
That's their marketing spend on paid channels.
Cool, thank you.
We're actually going to have a 10-minute break. We're going to be 15:15 on that phone up there, and I then have Councillor Cooper, Councillor Sayers, Councillor Wayne Walker and Councillor Darby. Thank you.
Hey, John. I hear somebody calling you. Urgent. It's a crisis.
Okay, right.
You had a question, were we not?
Gentleman writing first.
Sorry. He's going to ask the basis.
Excuse me, waitress. Excuse me, waitress.
2, 4, 6, 8,
Two streets
10,
on
11, right.
What's your third one?
Councillor Cooper.
Thank
That means
you.
I'm in jail.
Sally and Kevin were on it.
I'm in jail, third stroke, I think.
Mr Chairman, if you don't mind me, a little bit of a preamble to my question, and then I don't need to speak to the actual item, if that's okay. It won't be a big deal. Just want to... No, I think we've had enough of that. Just what it is, I suppose my question is around why is this the only review that straight up asks for a 5% reduction? No other one of these reviews has a title, cost efficiency plans. And I'm saying that because, I mean, I just wonder if that's more political than anything, and I know that doesn't come from you, but I know there's drivers for these sorts of things. Because if we look at, we won't be able to answer the question how much of this is statutory, non-statutory. So if you look at the 1% of our rates, $2 in every $100 of rates, which I think for me is about, what's that, $4,500 is $90, is it? Or it might be $9, I don't know. It's small. Anyway, and then if half of that was statutory, it's only 1%. So, yeah, I just want to understand that because we know also, for example, we're doing a lot of consultation, as you said, but the drive from our customers is we want more consultation. I never heard that before. I didn't know, for example, with the unitary plan, we did a draft. We went out twice. We're doing a plan change at the moment. We're going out twice because people's perception is that we don't talk to them. And so we're doing a non-statutory, then we're doing the statutory one. And the very driver is our customer because they think we communicate poorly. So I suppose that's why I'm asking. And the other thing is we've got cost efficiency plans. It says in this requirement, number 2, require 5% on top of, over and above any existing efficiency targets. So everybody's doing efficiency targets already. Everybody's been asked to save $1 million here, save $2 million there. I mean, in the regulatory space, we're struggling because of cuts, but then we get complained about because we haven't got enough building inspectors to, clear backlog. So what I'm not understanding is why impose this, require it, or recommend to require it, when there's already efficiency targets, and it's the only one, and you can't tell us what's a requirement and what not, the percentages of a requirement and not a requirement. So for me, yeah, it feels arbitrary.
Sally.
Yes, so again, using the United Kingdom effectively as our leading practice guide, they have embarked on a set of efficiency targets for areas in the public sector that they categorise as discretionary. And we were interested, this is a value for money review perspective. Remember, we are looking at both cost effectiveness and efficiency. And we were interested that year on year, particularly in the communications and engagement area, the UK public sector was typically finding between 15 and 25% savings from a range of management practices which we used essentially as the basis of our review. So we were looking at both efficiency and effectiveness, and when we looked at these management practices, and there's about 12 of them, we found that they were not universally or ubiquitously being applied, and our sense was that there was no strong efficiency driver within this particular service sector, which up till now we had been looking at 3 waters and domestic waste. In the context of what we were reviewing, we saw a very strong, well-documented efficiency plans. But in this service, we did not see very strong documented efficiency plans. And so we decided that, to encourage effectively a future efficiency ethic on what is largely an area of discretionary public expenditure, that an efficiency discipline would be good, particularly in relation to the recommendation that plans are formally documented and expenditure. It goes to this notion of investment logic that I've talked about before, where it's very clear where the expenditure is going in terms of financial and human resources towards what outcome is being sought in those areas related to the performance objectives where communications and engagement play a very significant role. We think that's a very good discipline for the public sector to have in the service, which is what motivated us to suggest this target.
Thank you. And just another one. So I'll look forward to seeing what is discretionary and what isn't. The other one is we're using the English model, but we have an Indigenous population here, and you've highlighted that through all those reviews that we must do that better. Did we not think to go to somewhere like Canada, where they have an Indigenous population and will have this similar policies? Like England doesn't seem to have that, and in Australia I don't think they are worried about it. But Canada might have been a better, model, because they do have that. I'm just wondering, because it just isn't apples for apples, which you highlighted in your report. There was a lot of oranges and apples stuff going on.
We went to the United Kingdom because they have, for the last 10 years, a very mature value for money discipline. And so we've been guided not so much by the qualitative, if you like, value elements, such as cultural and social value, but the process of finding value.
I understand that, but I think it doesn't speak to the drive for Māori engagement, which is cultural, and it has got a lot of that element in it. But anyway, it'll be good if we could somehow look at a little bit of that in our investigation.
Be noted.
Thank you.
Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I indicated my call to speak when Councillor Kathy Casey was talking about the trust and confidence factors and measures that we had. So I just want to ask a couple of questions around that, Mr Chair, probably a little bit wider questions, and that's just confirming, perhaps the question is directed to you, Kevin, is the total savings for this program we've identified over 10 years is 370 million, is that correct?
Qualifying that, yeah, these indicative numbers, order of magnitude, about that, yep, these four reviews,
yep. Okay, and just confirming that so let's say if we divided that by 10, 37 million a year on average, and the group revenue being about 4.2 billion, just confirm that, just, my calculation around that, we're looking at efficiency and cost savings around about 0.8%. So my point here, Mr Chair, around that is that I actually believe that the public, and I've mentioned this many times, are looking for their confidence and trust in Auckland Council would be increased if they could see even greater savings than 0.8%. So what I think is that, and you've just touched on it too, and I really appreciate your comments around what the learnings from this, is that we are not setting those hard stretch targets to make those savings in the eyes of the Auckland public. And as I mentioned at the time of the setting of the rate strike, significantly higher savings probably wanted to be achieved without affecting frontline services. And at the time, the comment back was, we can't achieve that. We can't make bigger savings without cutting frontline services. So I still believe, Mr Chair, that we're not going to improve our trust and confidence rating with the general public without doing that. So even though there's some fairly good work that's come out of here, now we're going to go away and do more.
spend more time and money on doing this, where I think the mistake we're making is not setting a stretch target in terms of our savings across the organisations that's firm at 10% savings per annum.
Right, I'm going to take that as a statement, so you don't need to answer it because there's no questions. So thank you, Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, just want to raise a couple of issues, and the first goes to cost benefit. And my concern around that is I see a lot of emphasis around cost, but insufficient around benefit and measuring that. And in particular, the benefits that I'm talking about are the benefit from collateral things that we can do with the business sector, collaborative things we can do with the volunteer sector, the immense value attached to
so, Wayne,
them.
Sorry.
So,
I mean, obviously,
how are we measuring benefits?
Resolutions F and G cover off what we're going to come back with and answer those questions. I mean, Kevin?
No.
Restate.
I was just going to say exactly the same as the Chair, yes. So the next stage then goes into how effective are we in delivering these strategies. Is the methodology the right one? What are the costs and benefits attached to changing the model? And one in particular is the top-down approach. Are we actually ensuring that what are the biggest drivers of change, including things like trust and value for the organisation, are they where we're actually focusing our communication engagement spend? Can we actually honestly say that? And so quite a few of these are related to that factor. Where is the benefit truly being achieved, be it through the rates we charge or the benefit directly to our citizens within the region?
Okay, and the other question I've got just goes to one that some others have raised around comparing apples with apples. Are we redefining communications and capturing things that might not have otherwise been in a communications framework, so that the nature of our communications is changing over time? And does that alter the numbers over time in communications?
That they've reported back is we need to make a move towards more digital platforms. I think that is the key change. Kevin, Sally?
Yeah, look, I think through the Chair you've got to break this into the two component pieces. One is the services, be that brand, marketing, internal communication, all those aspects there. It's the services. So that's determined what's in scope of this review. The second piece is exactly what the Chair's just referred to. How are you delivering those services? Is it true value for money in the way we are delivering them? So we weren't looking to expand the scope of what is deemed to be communications and engagement. I'll just emphasise the point, it's not just communications. It's communications and engagement. It's quite wide-reaching already. And you've got a list on that slide, and it's within the report, of the types of services that are actually encompassed by that phrase already, which is quite wide-reaching.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Just exploring that 5% reduction for the next 3 years as well, as Councillor Cooper was. Going by the recommendation here, that's for the part of the comms and engagement spend that is supported by rates. It's quite specific in that regard. So if you take an entity like ATEED or maybe even RFA, where the comms and engagement team is undertaking classic comms and engagement, but it's the same team as a marketing team. It's driving revenues up. There's no suggestion that those parts of the so-called comms and engagement team have their budget stripped back by 5%. Is there? And if so, what are the implications for the expectation that they continue to drive revenue? My understanding is that the marketing teams that drive visitation to zoo, gallery, that drive, attract people to conventions, and with ATEED's case, visitor economy, events economy, they are in the marketing part of the comms and engagement team. I just want to get a sense that we're not going to impact them and therefore revenues.
Through your Chair, the assumption is correct.
But then the numbers don't matter.
Well, that's pretty to the point. Thank you very much.
Right. Nico.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I actually had the same question as Councillors Cooper and Darby, but I just want to clarify one aspect of it. I was trying to work out why this had clear reduction in cost targets and not the others, and I think, Kevin, you said to us, because the evidence that you came up with was that there wasn't the same rigour in management practices and efficiency in this service as in the others that you looked at. Was that simply the view of the internal group, or was that a shared view between yourselves, your subject expert, and your independent reference panel?
That was supported by our expert and our independent reference panel.
Okay, and that stands in stark contrast, for example, to the investment review that we're about to look at, where it came out with quite different findings.
Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Newman and then Councillor Cashmore.
Yeah, thank you. I shared some of the concerns that were raised actually by Councillor Cooper, and subsequently some number of questions have been asked with respect to that recommendation too, around the 5% annual reduction. And Sally, I note that you talked about the based on the UK model of the classification of C&E as being discretionary. My concern relates to Auckland Transport's and Watercare's function as part of, as an infrastructure provider, to get their consents, which requires a significant and professional engagement and consultation for the purpose of limited notified and notified consent applications, which to me is very important, and they must be protected. Now, I understand that Watercare, obviously, because they are self-funded, but Auckland Transport is council, it's council rates funded. So does that function, that statutory function to get a consent and the requirement for that professional consultation and engagement, is that captured within that recommendation? Because I don't want to vote for a recommendation that fetters Auckland Transport's ability to resource its ability to get a consent.
Yep.
I think Ross will be able to confirm this, but I think that we actually fund Auckland Transport to the extent of 18% of its operating costs per annum, which would include communications and engagement. So that, how does that translate, Ross, to?
I suppose to answer the question, is it potentially impacts, but at the same time, Auckland Transport Communication Engagement were comfortable with the recommendation, because there is a long list of activities that they could make those savings in without, when they assess what areas of the business they don't want to impact.
Auckland Transport might be comfortable. I'm not sure that I am, though, because I'm wondering about what is the opportunity cost for them. Because to me, this is a non-negotiable area. They can't cut that, because we want infrastructure to be built. It has to be consented. There is a process for that. So I'm a bit nervous about voting through a figure without actually understanding the mechanics that underpin that.
At this stage, these are orders of magnitude estimates for further work to be done.
Business case. Yeah. Perhaps I can just a couple of comments through the chair. One is we also still have to distinguish between what has to be done and how it's done. There's no question that this is a requirement for Auckland Transport to achieve consent. Are we conscious of how they're actually going through that consultative process and engaging the communities? Are they using the same suppliers across the group that we may be charging fundamentally different rates through? Is the consultation able to be piggybacked, or other mechanisms at all? So some of it's the how, but probably more importantly than that is just what Ross Churnside just said then, which was these are indicative numbers based on what we've seen overseas. The business case still has to come back, and whether it's a full-fledged business case or an analysis of the risks attached, each of the entities will be coming back along with the parent to actually say that 5% could be met or couldn't be met by doing these things, and we'll now communicate that to you and identify the risks attached with those being done. If they come back and say, look, we cannot see any change in those particular consenting areas, there's a no-go there, then that's fine. That becomes part of the substance that comes back to this committee for consideration.
I must admit, feedback from Wally Thomas at Auckland Transport has been, you know, there's certainly things we can move straight away on, and that's group procurement was one of them, and he can see, yes, we can make savings there straight away. So, Councillor Cashmore.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair. It's not a question to our experts, but more perhaps to our CFO, and that this value for money work has been ongoing in this council for 6 years, and we've been driving savings all the way through. And one example is our cost of procurement. The last financial year dropped by $106.1 million, and I believe it's $20 or $30 million to date so far this financial year. So I was wondering if the CFO, for the benefit of some councils, could actually give an outline of what the savings have been across the board that we've achieved to date. So we've got a flatlining OPEX, but we've grown by the size of Hamilton. There's been substantial savings in group borrowings. There's been substantial savings in assets deliveries. And I think some people just need to hear what the facts are. This is great work we're doing looking forward, but it's also been historical work that the past councils have driven through. And I think there needs to be some optics around that. Sue.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, in response to your question, Councillor Cashmore, we have, best way to reference that point is to take you back to the annual report to 30 June 2017, as released to the New Zealand Stock Exchange at the end of September. And you'll see within that report that it notes quite clearly the level of savings that have been achieved since amalgamation, which is in excess of $270 million since 2010. There are a number of items within that, and you, again, Councillor Cashmore, thank you, you've quite clearly articulated some. It also includes other significant savings that have been achieved by renegotiating contracts on a group basis to make sure that we are achieving rates that are consistent right across the entire council group. And what the officers referred to is that these numbers that are estimates that are to be proven, which if I may also take this moment to remind the councillors that that is why I think it's now recommendation F and G, is that correct? Democracy, thank you, was added, is that we have got to, we're seeking direction from you today as to whether you actually agree with the recommendations that the team and I will go away and work up further with others involved across the council group to bring back detailed business cases where those numbers will be proven or not. Now, to come back to the point about cost savings, these numbers that you're seeing and these estimates are in addition to your point, Councillor Cashmore, to what we have already done. The last point that I would make is that, and just again to remind you all, is that we have to achieve the savings that are set out in our budget each year in order to comply with our legislative requirement to operate a balanced operating budget.
Thank you.
Councillor Hills.
Yeah, thank you. So back to the points of probably Councillor Cooper and Darby. I'm a bit confused then of the savings we want to make are based on the ratepayer funded services, but you've got large numbers expected from the CCOs in each financial year. And if we talk about the big numbers, that's RFA and AT, but we are directing them to raise money by doing marketing, by doing, travel, tourism, events. Half the savings are coming from those CCOs, and then we've also got some issues with Watercare having a very small comms and engagement budget, and that being an issue. So I'm almost worried we're setting up this staff to fail here a bit, because we're asking for savings from what we just confirmed is a largely a pull from non-ratepayer funded. I mean, especially in RFA's case, and AT'd comms and engagement, that's around marketing, tourism and events and conventions. So I'm a bit confused at where the numbers come from, the 10% savings, when half of them are from the CCOs.
Through the Chair, the savings target is based on the rates funded portion which each CCO receives.
But then, well, the numbers don't add up. Then but we're also asking for the, yeah. But if what you were saying before is, I mean, if RFA's marketing budget is largely marketing the events where they raise $110 million sell $110 million worth of tickets a year, then that is not ratepayer-funded comms and engagement budget.
Through the chair, if we use RFA as an example, the savings would only be on 30% of their comms and engagement budget, which is a portion which is ratepayers funded.
Yeah. Yeah. But the figures are based on 46.5 million over the whole.
Through the chair, 46.5 million is the total expenditure in the year June 2017. When we start adjusting for the savings, we then take out the rate. We then assess the ratepayer funded portion, which is how the calculation was done.
But the calculations, you're asking for 32. To me, it doesn't add up. You're including the top figure for the saving numbers. When you look into the graphs of 3.5 million a year.
Right. Just while we're just interrogating those figures, Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question directed back to the CFO, following on from the Deputy Mayor's question about the cumulative savings since the start of the Super City. You mentioned 270 million, Sue, over the 7 years. I think it's important to, in my mind, to also understand the cumulative revenue figure over that time as well, which I don't know if you can give an estimate of that, Sue, roughly what's been the cumulative revenue for the group over 7 years?
I'm sorry, through the chair, I don't have that number to hand. We can get back to you on that.
Okay, it's probably, I've made an estimate, it's certainly over 20 billion. So again, you know, when I look at that and the public look at it, they see a 0.1 to a 0.2% savings. Just, I think we could do better. Thank you.
That's a good question. Right.
6 billion.
Do you have any feedback to Councillor Hills? Will be afterwards, will it?
Yep.
Yep.
Just confirm those numbers in a minute, thank you.
Right, well, we have no more speakers, and there have been no one again indicating. So I'm going to put Resolution D. All those in favour? Aye.
Aye.
All those against? Right, good.
We weren't having speaking turn? No? You don't want to
I asked, and I said there was no one indicated speaking, so I moved the resolution, and that was it. We're away. So we're now on to E. Okay, investment attraction and global partnerships. I will say, Councillor Hills, when we get to F and G, before I put F and G, there'll be a point there for general comment as well. So. Okay, Jean-Pierre.
Thank you. So this review covered investment attraction and global partnerships. Global partnerships covers the civic or city-to-city international relationships, and investment attraction is the attraction of business and investment. So these are two related but slightly different services. The combined budget for these services is modest and stable, but they have potential to pack an economic punch in terms of the amount of new investment they are associated with. What we found was that these services are well organized, they're clearly aligned with strategy, and they take an evidence-based approach to prioritizing resources. The business processes accord with good practice, and there's significant coordination effort with the many other agencies and interests in this field. And this is an important point because the partnership and investment attraction landscape is a crowded space with many local and central agencies involved in trying to attract business and investment from abroad within a complex web of relationships. That creates a risk of duplication, especially, but on investigation, it looks that like the local and central government agencies involved seem to have good process in place now to manage this risk. They clarify how they work together and they regularly share information, and all the feedback is that seems to be working increasingly well. There is still an opportunity to have a clear Auckland investment story. That is how the various Auckland agencies with investment functions fit together, and to ensure they have a shared understanding of investment priorities and sequencing, which is going to be crucial given the significant amount of transport, housing, and other infrastructure investment coming up. So one of our recommendations addresses that particular issue. The other area we make a recommendation on is, whilst it may not be appropriate for all partnership and investment attraction services, some of these services are candidates for cost recovery or user charges because they deliver direct private benefits to the investors and the businesses involved. So that's a concept that could be or should be investigated in more detail. And then our third broad finding is that the current headline performance measures, such as the number of deals and foreign direct investment attracted, are not compelling measures of value for money or success. We acknowledge that showing what difference these functions, these services make is not easy, and economic development agencies around the world struggle with it. But there is scope to do a better job on showing the impact of the different services that are being provided. And that's what the third recommendation is about. Potential options include measuring, to measure impact include post-implementation project evaluations and customer satisfaction measures and the like. And that's our third area of recommendations.
Okay. Right, well, I'm assuming there's positivity about this. And we have Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, just got a question. As compared to some other areas where you've made comparisons, you know, with the UK and the like, has there been any comparative analysis you've done with other cities around this area?
Yes, and there's a description of good practices from the OECD and Icarus in slide. Page 278.
Okay. That answers your question, Wayne. Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Oh, it was just a wee paragraph in the bowels of the report about Auckland Council's spend on these functions is at the higher end of the various measures. Is that what you're going to look at, this line by line, if things are gold-plated, that you're going to reduce them down to their lesser value? Because you didn't... Are we looking at this budget?
Sorry, I'm unclear what the question is. Could you repeat?
You gave the impression to me, and I might have misheard you, that it's a modest spend and and it's kind of doing okay. Is that kind of? And the chairman said positivism, but in here it says you're spending too much on some functions. So how we just letting that go? I don't understand where this particular review's at.
So this particular review, the two service areas together spend costs are about $4 to $5 million a year, depending on what you count, and they're associated with hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign direct investment. So, and the only comment we make is that the budget is stable and modest. I can't recall any other.
Yeah, that's what I heard you say. So I'm quoting directly from your report, where it says Auckland Council's spend on all these functions together is at the higher end on various measures. So, obviously if they're at the higher end, they could be at the lower end, and there could be some savings in there.
I just point out to the Chair, if you read after the comma there, but there are concerns about comparability of data.
So you're saying they're not at the higher end?
It appears to be at the higher end, but we've just got to consider the apples and pears issue. Are we actually doing a direct comparison between what's included in those functions versus what we do here?
So that's part of the review? If there's an overspend in some areas, you'll be looking at that? Or is that part of your modest, it's okay, we're doing fine?
The review tried to find benchmarks internationally and domestically about how much is being spent on these services. And the finding at that time was that it was around the higher end of those services, but it was hard to make comparisons.
So where do we leave that at? Sorry, I'll take some guidance from the chair. So we've got some high spend, but we can't compare them with other things.
That's what they're saying.
But the experts are saying they're a higher spend. So are we just quite happy to leave it at the higher spend, or what?
Well, they're saying the results and the outcomes have been
worth it.
Pretty good.
If it's a higher spend, though, it's a higher spend, and it could be a lower spend, but this budget's untouchable, it seems to me. Is that right?
Just through the chair, if you remember, again, right back in March, we had this discussion when it came down to what are we going to use benchmarks for. The benchmarks are one aspect of evidence that we build into this discussion. So where it is absolutely conclusive, you may actually give it more weight. In this particular case, it's the high end. It's still comparable, but we're not quite sure whether the exact functions are like for like. So it becomes part of the consideration. It's not the only one. What you then resort to is what is the actual function we're actually trying to achieve? What are the outcomes to be achieved? And they appear to be relatively effective in delivering on those. And as the overall spend in proportion to the spend of the council group is not high, how much more effort do you want to go in to try and find a direct comparative? So the benchmark was a useful piece just to feed in. It's not way out of scope, it's comparable, but it is towards the higher end of them when you compare them to some others, based on what we appear to be seeing. It's not conclusive, but it's a useful piece of information to help guide the observations, the findings leading to those recommendations.
I can see you're convinced there, Councillor Casey.
Not at all.
Mayor Goff.
Not in the least.
Just on the last question, Mr Chair, it does say the combined budget is not large and is stable. So
yeah, that's what he said. Modest, not large, stable, doing a good job. So we'll just leave the gold plating in the functions. That's
well,
fine.
I'm not sure that it is gold plated. It doesn't suggest that it is. But my question is a somewhat different one. It doesn't deliver any great level of savings to us, but it does suggest how we can improve performance by a single investment story, and I think that makes sense. But I'm just wondering about the other specific recommendation, which is a fee for service. Now, if we're delivering a big result for a private company investment-wise, why would that be met by the ratepayer instead of by the company? But the fact that you haven't put a figure to that suggests that that's pretty uncertain or it's not too big. Can you elucidate on that a little bit for us?
It is, as you say, it's uncertain. There are indications that some of the services provided are of direct private benefit. Previous attempt was made in, I understand, 2014 that didn't result in any user charges being collected, but it's unclear about it's unclear why that was and whether there was effort or there not being any services being provided that had any private benefits. So it's something that needs further investigation. It's prima facie there are services being delivered that contain private benefits, and from an equity perspective, the review would say that it's worthwhile having a closer look at.
Okay, so there's not a bankable return there yet. It's just worth having a look at. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gibbon.
Mr Chair, I was musing to myself that this information would have been helpful for the debate on whether to apply a targeted rate on the commercial accommodation providers. If their forthcoming work stream is to study the feasibility of a move to fee-for-service imposed directly on business who derive benefit from this, will that consider, therefore, whether that is the appropriate mechanism for deriving revenue from those operators as opposed to a targeted rate?
Yeah. Look, yeah, through the chair, political philosophies and other things to take into account here, but one is the notion of if actually things are being delivered and it is being rated for, do you wish to identify a particular sector within the rating environment that should be paying more than others? This is much more targeted now, specifically identifying a benefit to a specific business. Do you believe there should be a fee charged there? Building on the comment before, I know that what was undertaken before was almost like a voluntary membership piece that AT were pushing for, and that didn't have much of a pickup. Do we believe that outside of the rating environment, there's actually a notion that we could actually be charging direct fees for direct benefits, business by business?
Is that a supplementary to or alongside or instead of?
Alongside or supplementary to what?
Well, one option is we're rating the commercial property value of a small cohort of ratepayers. Another option is that we're directly charging them fees for service for the delivery of business and tourist attractions. So, does that are you looking at that debate?
Well, yeah, what this is doing is investigating the notion of charging a fee. I draw a comparison between it's, for instance, if you deem it's appropriate to rate for stormwater, do you identify a particular sector that you believe gets more as a sector than another? And that's really what rating differential is about, as opposed to charging a fee for a direct benefit being achieved by a particular organisation.
See that come back, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Walker, very
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. One was, frankly, very similar to the question that Councillor Newman raised. Just to say that I lend support to his questions as it goes to the sector that benefits from tourism, if we call it that, being charged fairly rather than simply the accommodation part.
Councillor Walker, don't repeat Councillor Newman's question.
So the other question I've got just goes to the one I raised earlier, which was around overseas benchmarking. I mean, I note page 278, which refers to comparison, I think, with 69 other councils, but they're New Zealand councils, not the comparison between our city, which is a city of scale, with other cities around the planet. So I'll just leave that, Mr. Chair, but I would like to have some comparison at some time.
Councillor Cashmore.
Mr. Chair, I guess the question is, again, not to the group but to the CFO, and that is about our income streams as compared to expenditure streams and what is included and excluded. So, for instance, when we have an income stream, things like vested assets are counted as income. And when we have expenditure streams, things like depreciation and modernisation are included, and interest. So perhaps a comment from the CFO about net income and net expenditure might be worthwhile for the context of this discussion here today.
Not terribly relevant today, but given that Councillor Say has brought this up, and so I'm going to allow that question and response from Sue.
Thank you. Through the Chair, Councillor Cashmore, good question. When you look at revenue growth, if we look back over the past 3 to 4 years, you'd see on average that around about 40% of that revenue growth, very close to that, would represent vested assets in council. There's also obviously a consequential OPEX cost of that. If you then also look at some of the other contributors of that revenue growth, again over the last same 4 years, which is obviously a period where we've seen very large growth around the Auckland region, you also got to consider that close to 20% of that revenue would relate directly to capital expenditure. And what I mean by that, it's funding that you receive and you source directly from developers, from NZTA, and also obviously the interim transport levy. So that's all in your revenue bucket. To your point around operating costs, again, just a reminder, the balanced operating budget has to include interest and depreciation. And again, looking at what those costs of depreciation and interest alone would be over the same, say, 4-year period, it's close to 340 million.
Thank you. Right. There are no more questions. There are no one who wants to speak, so I'm going to put E. Moved and seconded. All those in favour with E?
Aye.
Aye.
Against?
No.
No? Okay. You want that recorded, Councillor Casey? Yep. No, okay, not recorded. Right, well, we're just going to go to F and G. I know I'm the mover, but I'm actually not going to speak to them. I'm going to ask for general comments, and then let the Mayor finish off with the final say before we put F and G. So effectively, F and G are the next stage, enabling, working out the strategy, and to come back in February, which is before we finish the consultation on the LTP. So it starts to, not starts, it further informs our debate that will be occurring in May. So, and obviously any further work that comes from any recommendations we may make at a meeting in February can then be reported back to either the March meeting or any of the LTP workshops. So I know Councillor Hills, you wanted some general comments?
I want to say something. And then I'll go after
Councillor Simpson, yep.
Okay. So thank you, Mr Chair, and well done. I've been unusually quiet in this finance and performance meeting around this because obviously I've been part of the political working party, and therefore my questions that I've had around this have been answered before today. I'd like to congratulate the Mayor, and I don't do it very often, but I really do want to give credit where credit's due on your leadership around this, because it wasn't just in agreeing to meet the legislative requirements that you've taken this on, but you did it. You absolutely asked the staff to do a deeper dive into the value for money and showed transparency around that. We are the first council, my understanding is that we're the first council in New Zealand to do that. We're the biggest, and I believe it's really important to be the leader in this field. I also believe it's important, very important, to show ratepayers that their hard-earned money is indeed delivering value for money, and that we are efficient and effective in what we do. To this point in time, as has been mentioned, Auckland Council has delivered well in excess of $250 million worth of savings to compare to the other councils combined. This report, in my opinion, takes that as a given, and in 4 areas, water, waste, comms, investment attraction and global partnership, delivers independent expert advice on how a greater level of savings and value for money and their strategies can be achieved. To that end, of course, I've supported all the recommendations, and I commend Sally, you, Kevin and the team for their extensive work in delivering these to date. But, Mr Chair, I believe the next 2 recommendations are the most important, because it's the next steps and what we do with the information that's been provided to us that I believe are vitally important. This is only 4 of 30 that we are looking in this area. But how we take that information and how, as a council, we give the leadership back to the staff, following what the Chief Executive comes back to us, I think will be the deal breaker. So I absolutely support the next 2 recommendations. Thank you.
Councillor Hills.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, just congratulations to the staff and the people who worked on this. I know it's been extremely difficult, interesting, full on. But I do have, overall it's a good story, and I think, as all of us have been doing since the day we walked in November last year, we've been trying to get outcomes but also save money as many places as we can. And I think there's some really good opportunities to save money. I am disappointed, however, that partially or bits of this report were leaked to the media and were given, the media were given half statements, and that got confused into things like staff, when actually the 46 million was the whole operations of the communications engagement consultation, everything council does. And then I got a little bit more annoyed that we start mentioning staff cuts and things in such a way. We pass a living wage this year to help support and value our staff, and then we go around and throw things like staff cuts out there without conversations. Staff found out about this through the media on Saturday, and it was pretty tough for a lot of them. A lot of them who work outside normal hours for, pretty tough considerations. They're doing their own work plus all the reactive work through this. So the comms thing to me is a concern. As a local board member, we were always asking for more and more and more comms and engagement when I was on the local board. The last couple of weekends we've been out doing stuff for Panuku about the stuff going on down there. People are worried, people are happy, people are concerned, so there has to be extensive amounts of consultation, door knocking with businesses, printed things, signs up, people there to explain things. We have our local boards doing parks upgrades, and the community wants to know what it's going to look like, what are the options, how do we give people more choices. That is all comms and engagement. The annual plan this year, we increased from 3,000 submissions last year to over 8,000 submissions that year. That was all done through communication, consultation, marketing, and then the comm staff had to read and decipher every single submission and go through that. So we need to make sure that we are careful here when we go through this, that we don't cut off our nose to spite our face, because people are continuously asking for more information, more ways to connect to council, and more ways to understand what's happening. One example this week, all Auckland Transport are doing is changing 2 car parks in Devonport from normal car parks to electric vehicle car parks. We've got signs there, it's online, there was a letter drop, there's posters, and we had local media asking us why this was such poor consultation and why weren't we putting more consultation. There's about 5 ways of consultation happening, and it still was not good enough. So we cannot do this with no money, and I think everyone is trying. The new network is coming. For the North Shore, we had quite a few meetings, people confused. We had 2,000 submissions. We had 20 of the new network routes changed due to consultation. Next year, when it gets implemented, we have to send this out to residents. We have to put it on the sides of buses. We have to put it everywhere out there so people know why we're doing it, how they get to their bus, what changes are coming. And we get it in the neck, 1,000 tweets, 1,000 messages, 1,000 emails about we don't know what's happening, we're confused, it's very difficult, what's going on, people, and then we get that whole, everyone, council is bad. So even when we do spend a lot and try and get it to the best, we can never quite get it right. So I just want us to be careful that we don't just arbitrarily go in and cut things and take things out when people are desperate for more and more information. In the RFA, ATEED, that is all marketing spend to raise money so we don't have to put our rates into RFA. Last year we complained about them going over budget. They went over budget by 11 million because they had 250 more events and 25 more events at stadiums than they'd budgeted for. But if you look on the other side of the ledger, they made $7 million more after-tax profit than they were planning to as well. So we have to be looking at both sides. Often the spend is increasing non-ratepayer revenue. So I could go on forever, and I'm absolutely supportive of the procurement, the ideas. A lot of the ideas you've come up with are fantastic. Shared procurement, ways we can get discounts through the media agencies and advertising agencies, that's great. But I'm just really careful that we go take a red pen to a lot of the stuff that people expect us to be telling them in 40 different ways. And, the social media is increasing, and I see it in the middle of the night. I'll get tweets and texts and things about why is my bus late or what's happening here. And there is staff manning these things 24 hours sometimes, especially during civil emergencies and things at the beginning of the year, because that's what people expect. So if we want to be an international city that celebrates great things and supports our communities, it's not always about just ripping things apart and pointing out that the staff are doing a bad job, because actually that's our fault when we go and bag them on social media. And that's our fault that people don't like council, because we don't say good things about our own council. So I'm sorry to rant, but I was pretty annoyed last week, and the staff were pretty upset. Go visit them, go talk to them, ask them how they felt to hear this stuff going on. So everything else I think is good, and we have to do this. But yeah.
And yes, we do have a code of conduct, and it has a clause relating to respect, so we should all reflect on that at all times, as it's to our fellow members and our staff. Councillor Newman.
Mr Chair, so I was an early sceptic of the 17A reviews. I think that's been pretty apparent. And I acknowledge that the Mayor extended this to address the strategic opportunities to improve value for money. I think that if I could just make a point in relation to the consultation, the communication. And just to reiterate the point that I was trying to make in my questioning in relation to the statutory functions of a couple of CCOs that require them, if you were going to go through a notified consenting process and they're required to do so for big infrastructure investment, there is a requirement for that professional function for the communications to be undertaken by the CCO as a requiring infrastructure authority, and that is non-negotiable. So I'm interested to know if we are going to go down the path, and the recommendations here would really require this exercise to take place. If we are going to go into a dive as to what those savings could be, that we do arrive at a point where we're cognizant of the opportunity cost of changes, because some of the changes that take place will cost money, but also too there are some things that cannot happen. Yep. And one of them is that we cannot remove the ability of Auckland Transport and Watercare to undertake that professional engagement if they go down the path of a notified consent.
No, very good point, and has been noted.
Chair, I think that some of the savings here are still quite theoretical, but I have to say, I really would like to see Three Waters. I think that is, look, one of the reasons why I think that we got amalgamation in Auckland in 2010 was around vertical integration of water. And I think that the Three Waters debate is a live one. But coming from my ward, I have to say I really would like to see Veolia involved in this discussion. They need to be there. It is not acceptable simply to sort of fall back on joint arrangements and a contract. For my ward, and this affects Franklin too, there are hundreds of millions of dollars of stormwater infrastructure that will have to be invested in the south in the next few years in the stormwater space. And if we're going to go down the path of the Three Waters model, that will have to be addressed as part of that relationship. And given that we have a retail franchise agreement that applies in Papakura and Franklin, I am not comfortable with just subrogating Veolia being subrogated to, they are going to be an add-on to Watercare to go and talk to them. I would like Veolia to be engaged in this process, given that they will have to be part of the delivery arm, given that that franchise agreement is in place for decades. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request, Mr. Chair. The final thing that I would say is that if there is going to be change, it is very much around an exercise of achieving value for money, but that does have to be cognizant of the fact that there is a human face to this debate. I take the point that Councillor Hills has raised, that people have to be able to come to work and survive the ebb and flow of debate that ends up in the public realm. I don't question the professionalism of the staff who work in the areas that are subject to a 17A review. I would like to think that this is an exercise in ensuring that we're improving the environment within which our existing staff will continue to work to add value, rather than just going down the path of saying, well, we're going to do a head count here and look at things in that context. This is about valuing people to do the job that they need to do in order to deliver the outcomes that we want. And that is particularly relevant in relation to areas that are growing rapidly and that require the infrastructure and services that my ratepayers are demanding, Mr. Chair. But look, I hope that the Mayor and the Chief Executive can take up my call to engage Veolia, because they have to be part of that Three Waters debate. They're not at the moment, but they have to be, and there are people within Veolia who would like to speak to this issue.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. And those couple of points are well noted. So, Councillor Philippa, Councillor Darby, and then I've got the Mayor to conclude the debate.
Thank you, Chair. And when I saw the agenda, I also was worried about the recommendations that were there. So I want to acknowledge Councillor Holst in regards to the advocacy around these. Just to acknowledge the fact that I think we have, and I'm definitely going to support the recommendations, because this particular issue, and His Worship the Mayor has mentioned the fact that it's from a statutory perspective, but we understand also in regards to value for money. We've heard one side, and it's a two-sided argument, two-sided issue, so I look forward to the second side. And that's the business case as a result of the recommendations that were done. So I want to acknowledge our leaders who are here who did the review. So ngā mihi kia koutou katoa to you, to the three of you. I also want to acknowledge Councillor Hills and Councillor Newman, and it's because they mentioned staff and Councillor Newman mentioned the human face. That's exactly it. I mean, you talk to the staff. Councillor Holst and I have the two CCOs reporting to our particular committee of the whole. That's RFA and ATED. And you talk to the CEOs of those two particular CCOs. I have no doubt it also applies to the others and how their staff's feeling as a result of 6 months in a leaky boat. So, you know, I mean, for whoever did this, and it hasn't been mentioned, but whoever has, I know I shared the whole comment around it. I'm disgusted in regards to what that person has done. And I need to mention that now. And it has to be mentioned. I'm disgusted. And I mean, we never, ever ended up having the leaks that we have with the Legacy Council. So, look, I just wanted to leave it at that, because for me, this is needed, and I look forward to the business cases, and let's go through together as Auckland Council, and with our hats on, our regional hats on, in regards to value for money. So again, congratulations to the team that did the review. Congratulations to also Chair you and the Deputy Chair in regards to the particular position we're in now with FNG. Kia ora.
Okay, Councillor Banner. Councillor Darby.
Yeah, likewise, I'd actually like to acknowledge Sally and the team, the consultancy experts that Sally's brought in, Kevin, you as well, your whole team. It's been a pretty rigorous, not pretty, actually a very demanding and rigorous exercise. I've been on the political oversight group as well, and I appreciate the regular weekly updates that we've been getting, just keeping us abreast of developments. There's a long way to go on this, of course, and this is the first stage over the line. Look, there's been a lot of time given to communications and engagement, and so there should be. But the one area that I probably think there's a lot to be gained out of is the recommended Three Waters strategy and policy. I think in time we will win hugely by finally coming to realise that we do need that in place. This time it's not just a strategy, but it's strategy and policy. And I was around in 2005 to 8 when this is what we were asking for, and we sort of got it half over the line, and it was all signed off, and really it ended up on the shelf. It really did end up on the shelf. And I think the opportunity within Three Waters strategy and policy is huge, and it's something that we really have to face up to. Watercare, in terms of the two waters, potable and waste, are doing extremely well. But in the area of stormwater, rainwater, I think with the challenges of climate change breathing down our necks, we have got to accelerate our learning in this area. And this is what I think the Three Waters strategy and policy can provide us with. I know that there's going to be some savings in the structural integration there, and you've pointed that out. But I would not be surprised if once this document gets before us, it actually points out deficiencies and quite considerable new costs. So this is value for money, but it's also looking and waking up to the outcomes for expenditure that our citizens expect. And in the water space, Mr. Chair, I believe that we are up for some phenomenal expenditure in the decades to come. This decade, in this 10-year plan, we'll start that, we'll embark on that journey, but future LTPs, I believe, are going to be spending tremendously in that area. But it won't be in traditional, pipe and dispose methods. It will be about acknowledging a sponge city and a water-sensitive design city, retaining its source and doing things smartly, using natural systems rather than hard infrastructure. It'll be soft infrastructure in the future, not hard infrastructure. And that's why I'm just stressing that this Three Waters direction is, in my view, one of the best things that's come out of this part of the review. In closing, Mr. Mayor, you've come under a bit of heat on this. I want to acknowledge you for staying the course and sucking up a bit of that heat because this has to be done, but we're only 20% down the track so far. We've got a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lovely. Mayor Goff, closing comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, look, this has been a tough process, and the people that I want to acknowledge mainly are our staff, because they have to go through the process of looking at what their colleagues are doing around council and asking the question, is there a way that we can do this better, more effectively and more efficiently? And that's never easy. So to all of our team at the bottom of the table, thank you. I think you've done a really professional job. I can't fault the process that you've worked. And I think having the external evaluation and the external experts coming in and working with you and finding consensus in that group has strengthened your recommendations. I welcome the consensus that we've got to around the table. I think it's really important that we go forward together on this. The theoretical figure is $373 million in savings. I say theoretical because until you deliver it, that's all it is. But it points to a direction, it points out opportunities. This is not about making savings for the sake of it. This is about making savings because every one of us come into this chamber with a dream and a vision for a better city, a great city, a world-class city. And we know what the level of demand is. $30 billion we could spend in the 10-year budget. We know we've got 10 million, and we know that while we want to realise those great things for the city, our fundamental responsibility as councillors is to provide fiscally responsible management. Because if we fail in that responsibility, we fail in everything. So every dollar that we can save by doing things better is another dollar towards the sort of services that we dream about providing to our fellow Aucklanders and investment in the infrastructure that is desperately needed. Now, the next step is important. It does need to be evidence-driven. There does need to be a sound business case. But what we are building on is a very good foundation that our officials have created for us. And there'll be glitches along the way. There'll be things that we find that we can't do in the way that we want to. There will also be some opportunities to get some early wins out of this, and we should be seizing it. I want to say there are three reasons why we need to do this. First of all, because we have an obligation to our residents and our ratepayers to use the money they provide us as effectively as we can. I say residents because some pay their rates through their rents and others pay their rates directly. But we cannot afford to waste a dollar when we've got so many things that we want to do. Secondly, it's really important to give the government confidence that when we go to them and say, we want this investment, we want this new form of revenue, that they have confidence in us that we are doing the job effectively. We had to persuade the last government of that, and we did. The Prime Minister, the former Minister of Finance, seems to have been a bit of a recidivist in this regard.
He's gone now.
But I've got to say that when I went down to Wellington last week, you know, there are a lot of things on the table about what we can do, but the Minister of Finance says what every Minister of Finance says. I want to make sure that what money you've got, you're spending effectively. And if we can't persuade the Minister of Finance and our constituents of that, then we're way behind the eight ball. And I do want to say that it is important to counteract the sort of criticism ill-informed or not, that we saw in the last 24 hours. I think our Chief Financial Officer has outlined that pretty well. Actually, our operating costs have stayed at 1.1 to 1.2%, about the rate of inflation, and the big expenditure has come on depreciation and interest because we're having to build a huge asset base to deal with a population that rises by 50,000. So we have to go out there and show that we are doing everything that we can reasonably. We need to be fair to staff, and I join with those who deplore that material is leaked publicly before the staff has been talked to. I just think that's rotten. I think it's unacceptable, and, you know, it ought to stop. Anybody with decency would think about the impact that has on people that are the object of what we're trying to do. But it happened. I can't stop that. I know that when I give something out to councillors within an hour and a half, it's in the public arena. That ought not to be the way that we operate collectively here. But come back to what we're on about today. It's about getting a consensus about how we can do things effectively and efficiently so that the money that we have can produce the city that we dream about. Thank you very much for your support for that, and I'm happy, I think I've already seconded the motion moved by the Chair to accept those recommendations.
Right. Thank you, councillors. I will compliment everyone on the standard of the questions today, and then interestingly not a lot of wide debate, which has been good. It's been more seeking more information, and I think we've, since Councillor Holst called me last night and we discussed amendments to the original recommendations, which were going to happen anyway, but we've come up, I think, on landed on a good space here. So I'm going to put FNG...
Just got one question. In regards to the review team now that's done this report, is that their job now done?
No, okay. The next one.
26.
4 down, 26 to go.
26 to go.
26.
Over the next 2 years.
We look forward to arguing with you.
So I'm going to put F and G. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Thank you. It's recorded as, and we note that it's unanimous. So there is no extraordinary business, so I'll now declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much. Thank you, team. Jean-Pierre, Ross, Nelly, Kevin.